If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
What is the scariest demon, ghost, entity, or paranormal thing you've ever encountered in your life that you couldn't explain?
About 25 years ago, my now former wife and I were caretaking a house. We had been there for several weeks, and we both noticed that we always had that feeling coming up the stairs from the cellar that something was going to grab you as soon as you turned the light switch off. Everything else about the house was normal. We slept with an analog wind-up alarm clock next to the bed, the kind that actually ticks. To set the alarm, you move a tiny third hand to the location on the clock face for the desired time. For example, halfway between 6 and 7 to awaken at 6:30. It's a physical process, and there is very little way to get it wrong. We always had the clock set to wake us up at 6 a.m. It was not something we fiddled with on a daily basis. One night, the alarm clock went off at like 2 in the morning. Old school ringing bells. Both my former wife and I woke up absolutely terrified. I saw a small figure, maybe 2 feet tall, run out of the room. I thought I must have been crazy until my former wife screamed, "Did you just see that thing?" We both described it as some sort of small gremlin. When we looked at the alarm clock, we saw that the alarm hand had been moved from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. That's the whole story. Scared the duck out of me. Have no explanation for it. Nothing else ever happened there, but the unsettling feeling persisted. Hello everybody, someone from the remote viewing community, which I recently joined, directed me here. I did my first 2 sessions a few days ago, and they went very well. I told him about my experience with this shadow figure, and he told me I should share it here. I want to start off by saying that my mom has had the same exact experience as me. Hers happened before mine, and she told me about hers also before mine happened. However, my mom woke up in the middle of the night and saw the figure. I was dead awake going to sleep. I am 18 years old, and at the time I was 16 or 17. Before closing my eyes to go to bed, I was watching TikTok or YouTube, and as I turned my phone off to go to bed, I kept my eyes open and was just thinking in my head. Let's imagine my room. My door is in the top left, where there isn't a wall. My bed is in the center of the back wall. My room was pitch black, and this humanoid figure didn't appear. It was just there when I looked at my door. My room was pitch black, and this figure was darker than the pitch black of my room. The figure was super tall as the ceiling, which is 10 or so feet, probably higher. I have tall ceilings. It was the scariest thing I have ever experienced. This figure was pure evil. My heart dropped, and I was deathly afraid. It seemed like it invoked that in me, not myself being afraid, if that makes sense. The same goes for my mom. Hers was a negative experience. I started praying to God for protection against this figure, and to ease and calm my mind, I opened my eyes, but it was still there. I stared at it for a bit longer, almost paralyzed in fear. I closed my eyes again and kept praying, and after 5 minutes of praying, I opened my eyes, and it was finally gone. Has anyone had a similar experience? Does anyone know the identity of this creature? On a completely off-topic note, I would love to communicate with the beings that want to help us, but I assume I am not in control of that. I also assume they know that I want to connect, communicate, and have an amazing relationship. Am I not ready, and is that why I have never had an experience other than this one? The basement in my dad's house is finished except for the storage room, which is really dark and creepy and is around the corner from the main room of the basement. There's an elliptical down there, and when standing on the elliptical, if you look over your shoulder, you can see half of the door to the storage room. I was working out on said elliptical, and I felt like someone was standing behind me, so I looked over my shoulder, and in that half doorway, a dark figure with light gray eyes was standing there looking at me. I was house sitting, so I know there wasn't anyone else home. I slowly got off the elliptical and went into the bathroom to hide, then a while later decided to be bold and rushed past the storage room and back upstairs. Not the first time I had seen that gray-eyed figure either. About 18 years ago, I moved into a 2-story house with my brother and 3 other roommates. The first night I was setting up my room, it was about 9 p.m., and my light was on in my room. I dragged a nightstand, arranged a mini fridge, and set up a couple of books. I turned around, and one of the roommates, Chris, was standing right in front of me, about 3 feet away. My door was still closed. It was also a creaky, heavy wood door from the 60s. I slightly jumped and was irritated, like, dude, what the hell? At least knock. My roommate stood there motionless, not a smile or frown, just bored and expressionless. He had on an Izod shirt with the alligator emblem, and I would even see loose pieces of fabric and extreme detail on his shirt and the texture of his skin and pores. I was like, what do you want? Still kind of irritated. He immediately disappeared in front of my eyes. I ran out my door downstairs to the living room. This same roommate was downstairs lying on the couch, playing video games with large headphones on, a hoodie, and long pants, different clothing. I said what just happened and explained what I experienced. He laughed and said, "Okay dude." Then just put his headphones on and kept playing video games. This was one of the weirdest, clearest paranormal experiences I have ever had up close in person, totally sober, as a 19-year-old. Strangely enough, my brother was the last person to work on cleaning up the house in the last week of everyone moving out, meaning he was the only one staying there, and he was cleaning up furniture, stains, and stuff like that to get the maximum deposit back. He never has any paranormal stuff happen to him, and he is not really into the topic at all. The last night he was sleeping there in his room, he told me that he saw an apparition of another one of our roommates, Mike, but Mike was just standing in front of him and glowed a light blue and had a bloated stomach. His brother said he almost appeared like a drowning victim. This unnerved my brother enough that he got a sleeping bag and slept in the closet and closed the door. He told me he woke up at 3 a.m., and this blue thing was standing over him, glowing in the closet. I asked him what he did then. He said he didn't know what to do, so he just covered his face to look away until the morning. This happened in Seattle, and in the couple of years I stayed there, I had many paranormal experiences in different houses and apartments. I was in first grade, home alone for maybe 20 minutes. My bedroom window, located on the second story, provided a view of the house's driveway, while another window on the second story was located in a room above the garage. This room had previously been a half-a-frame attic, which my parents had transformed into a finished room with a high ceiling a few years prior. Looking out over the driveway from that above garage room is a window with a pillowed bench built into the wall below the window that we sometimes would stack folded blankets on. I look out my window and notice something white in the window above the garage. I look at it for a few seconds and think it's a white blanket stacked on the bench, except it's weirdly tall and takes up most of the window. Then it moves. The only way I can describe the movement is as if someone was wearing a white sheet, akin to a stereotypical ghost costume, and they were leaning on a bench, their arms and elbows resting on the bench below the window. This object appears to rise and move away from the window, frightening me so much that I dash to my door, slam it shut, lock it, and sit with my back to it. A few minutes later, I hear my parents' car pull into the driveway, and I watch as they both walk to the garage door. No one else was in the house, and upon inspection, there was nothing on that bench or near it that could have created the impression of what I saw. This is happening in the White Mountains of NH, USA. I live on a farm and have been here since 2009. Over the years I've seen many strange things happen, some of which had been shared in here by a former friend on my behalf, specifically an encounter I had while hunting and seeing something on a thermal scope. I'm no stranger to strangeness. However, I'm more used to covert strangeness, if that makes sense. Full glasses sliding across wooden tables. Seeing strange things on my security cameras. Hearing strange noises in the middle of the night. Waking up with scratches or bruises that I don't remember getting. Things like that. Things that are strange but not entirely unexplainable. Recently something else has been happening, though. It started back in late October, and initially I thought it was a fluke. But it continued happening, and now it's an everyday occurrence. My farm has been blockaded by hundreds of crows. They show up every day, hundreds of them. And they're almost always completely silent. They land in the same pasture, where there's nothing for them to eat or do. And they just stand there, all day. From the time the sun rises to when it sets, they're there all day. If you approach them, they'll caw at you and fly out of your way, but they never leave. If you don't disturb them, they stay quiet and just hang out. And again, this is hundreds of crows. More than I've probably ever collectively seen in my entire life. It's been months. I don't know why they're here or what they're doing. I don't feed them or do anything to purposely attract them. They're in an empty pasture with no feed or water in it. But they come back every day. I can hear the outskirts of the croup cawing constantly, but once they're on my property, they're silent. I don't feel threatened by them per se, but it's not the best vibe ever. I've had lots of people comment on it, but nobody has any good explanation for it. What the duck is going on? This was the scariest encounter of my entire life. I was spending the night at a friend's house. Eating junk food, watching television, and staying up late playing games. As the night settled in, I dozed off. Hours had passed, and it was the middle of the night. I adopted the habit at an early age of sleeping with the covers over my head due to fear. This night was no different. I awoke in a cold sweat, already in a state of absolute terror. I peeked through the blanket and scanned around the living room. We had fallen asleep with a movie still playing. Only the television was frozen on a scene. I looked at my friends who were lying just around me. Both were frozen in time. One had his body stuck in a position as if he had just begun to change sleeping positions, arms were floating still as can be in the air, and his body was turned in an awkward position. My other friend, who I'm sure was still awake, had been eating chips. He was frozen in time, lying down and had a bag of chips in his hand. He was pouring the crushed chips into his mouth, they were frozen just above his mouth, falling out of the bag. All the while I heard a vortex of voices coming from all directions. Moments had passed, and I felt my blanket get pulled slowly off of me. The voices got more intense, and it was like they were arguing back and forth with each other. It was not any language I have ever heard. Suddenly they stopped, and I heard one voice say, "He is awake." This voice said it in an absurd tone of confusion. In an instant my blanket was pulled back over my shoulders into the exact same position it was before it was moved. The room vibrated intensely. Suddenly the room came back to life. I've never been in such a silent space before. The TV instantly continued and was extremely loud. My friend rolled over and continued his movement while changing sleeping positions. My other friend continued his movement and eating the chips. He had absolutely no recollection of what had happened. Frantically, he stood up and started down the pitch black hallway. I was terrified, but for a moment I sensed that whatever I was looking at, I could tell something was still there that was just as scared of me as I was of it. The pressure in the room returned to normal, and time continued as usual. So last night at 3 a.m. I was outside enjoying the stars when all of a sudden I knew I was not alone. The thing was big, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Me being me, I froze till I heard a very strange high-pitched sound in the near distance. Our property line ends at a creek. The neighbors' dogs were losing their minds, and at that point, I literally ran inside, and I could hear something chasing me. I did not look back. I locked my door and terrified jumped in bed with my husband. This is not our first encounter with this thing. My husband and I have both been outside pretty late and have suddenly felt like we needed to go inside and that we are in very real danger. We are scared for our children's safety and no longer go outside off of our porch at night. It doesn't seem to bother us if we're together, and it doesn't bother us if we're on our porch, nor does it bother me when I get home from work. My husband, on occasion, has been drawn to the creek and has had the sensation that there is something there twice now. This started happening about 6 months ago. We've lived here for 2 years, almost 3. Also, the wildlife around here acts really strange. More aggressive than I've seen in other places, but that could be because they are not as used to people. Anyway, local natives say there is a Bigfoot that lives around here, but I've never heard of a Bigfoot chasing someone, especially in a populated area like this. I have never heard of it feeling like this around one. I feel silly, but I'm genuinely freaked the F out. Logic says it's a big cat. However, I'm worried it's something worse. The first thing that comes to mind is a skinwalker. If it was a ghost, I wouldn't be so freaked. I can deal with a ghost. Please help. When I was 9 years old, I was biking home in the evening. We lived in the countryside up a small mountain. The road from the village was an uphill, a flat section, and then another uphill. The road lights only stretched to the end of the flat section. I was a bit afraid of the dark, so I stopped at the end of the road lights just at the bottom of the last uphill to gather courage to bike the last section home. It was a partial moon, so it wasn't pitch black, and at the end of the hill I saw a figure walking down towards me. I thought I'd wait until he or she got closer, as I would feel less afraid to bike in the dark if there was someone else close. But about halfway down the hill the person walked into a thin shadow of a tree on the road and never came back out. Just disappeared. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what I just saw and then panicked and biked down to the village and stayed there until my parents came driving and wondered why I never came home. They tried to explain it with stuff like the person might have gone into the woods or something. What they didn't disclose, though, out of fear that I'd never dare to bike home again, was that my father had seen the same thing walking home from work. He had seen her clear as day, walking down the hill for a while. When he looked down for just a second and looked up, she was gone, and there were no footsteps in the fresh snow. I later read a book about local legends, and apparently a lot of people during at least a century have seen her walking down the hill and disappearing halfway down. My youngest daughter loved this story, so we've been on ghost stakeouts, where we buy pizzas and snacks and hang out at the bottom of the hill, listening to the Ghostbusters theme song and trying to see the ghost. This was the early 2010s. I was a grad student doing midnight insect assays in the cotton fields outside of Texas A&M. Apparently no one ever checks the insect communities at night, and now I know why. The fields were well outside of the city on the banks of the Brazos River, so it was a solid 30-minute drive out there. I actually got pulled over by a cop since he wanted to know what I was doing out there at that time. You can get out of a lot by saying you're an entomologist. But besides the cop, I didn't see anyone else all night, I think. When I got out at the ag station where the fields are, the parking lot was empty, and there were only the sign lights on. I turned down the dirt road, our fields were way in the back, and I began the trek to the back of the property. As I was driving, I noticed headlights in front of me coming from the right down an intersecting road. I didn't think much of it since lots of people use this space, but the car notably seemed to be going the same speed and to be at the same distance from the next crossroads. To avoid late night shenanigans, I took my foot off the gas a bit. And the other car turned off their lights. I never saw it again. It wasn't at the crossroads, and I looked the way it had come and the way it was going. There were no tail lights visible. Okay. That was weird. But whatever, this is College Station, yahoos abound. I press on, there's still like a mile to my field site. Finally, I make it to the site. I turn my truck so my headlights are on my cotton rows, but I get my headlight out too for maximum insect viewing. I remember turning my car off only to find that my new truck is smarter than me and turns off its lights when that happens. So I put the keys back in, start the engine, and the lights come back on. That definitely wasn't movement by the back of the rows. Trick of the light. I open the door and I leave it open for some reason. I think I didn't want it to auto-lock on me at 12:33 a.m. out in a cotton field. Regardless, the truck is chiming loudly and annoyingly as I'm walking out into the field. I'm determined to ignore the annoying chime. I'm a 24-year-old guy, so obviously I believe I'm invincible and just turn on some tunes on my phone to drown it out, alone, in the dark, in a field. And what the heck is wrong with that coyote? I distinctly remember thinking. I could hear it over the music, but if you have heard coyotes, it always sounds like there's a lot, even if it's one or two. This was one coyote. And it was weird? Almost mournful? Pained? About 45 minutes into the fieldwork, and I'm on row 3 of 5. I haven't heard the weird coyote in a bit, so I haven't been thinking about it, mostly just counting ants. I stood up at one point and realized my car's lights weren't on the roads anymore. They weren't even on. I'm in the dark with just a headlamp, so I turn off my music and I start walking back to the truck. I realize on the way that the chime is not dinging anymore, and how the hell would the lights turn off if the engines are on? Also, how's the engine that quiet? The truck's not on. Okay. That's not great. Did I run out of gas? I get up to my open door and reach for the keys. They're gone. The keys are no longer in the ignition. Mild panic. I look down, and the keys are sitting in the middle of the driver's seat. Okay, mild panic is less mild. I put them back in the ignition, and I turn on the car. The lights don't come on. I leave my lights on auto because I'm lazy and forgetful. The lights are set to off now. And that's definitely not the wind moving through the cornfield behind me. I quickly hopped into my truck and drove approximately 60 miles to reach the gate. I didn't stop until I got to the first gas station on the way into town under the lights, and I checked the bed, and underneath, sure enough, I found someone ready to continue ducking with me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning I told my lab mates, and wouldn't you guess, they all had creepy shit happen out there. I went out to the field site to get my shit I had dropped. There were barefoot human footprints in the road. I never finished that experiment. No one ever went out there after dark again. I don't want to know who or what was in my truck. I'm a 26-year-old Mexican American who was born and raised in the small town of Walla Walla, Washington, where this event took place. I get home around midnight after a night out with some friends, 18 or 19 years old at the time, living with my grandparents, and I decide to watch some TV to fall asleep too. The TV was too bright, so I turned it off, so now it's pitch black. I remember opening and closing my eyes a few times, like normal, and as I'm doing that, darkness, darkness, darkness plus a scary face hovering in the dark clear as ducking day, and I freak the duck out because I am eye to eye with something I have never seen before. So my adrenaline kicks in, and I literally throw my pillow as hard as I could at it and rush to my light switch as if I was running from Satan himself. I turn on the light, and there's nothing there. Keep in mind I've never had any sort of psychological issues, I am a light sleeper, and this is my first ever paranormal experience. But wait, there's more. I don't remember telling anyone right away, so a few months go by, I move to Tri-Cities, Washington, and I'm at DQ with my parents and sis, and I decide to tell them what happened. Everyone besides my mom blew it off as nothing, and I noticed she had a pretty serious look on her face, and she said, "I've seen the exact same thing there before back when I was in high school." I knew for a fact she was telling the truth. Has anyone else experienced this before? I'd greatly appreciate your thoughts on what this actually was because I honestly do not know. Thanks in advance. When I was a child, both my parents went to work early, so they would drop me off at my grandmother's to eat breakfast and go to school from there. My grandmother died my junior year in high school, and I started coming straight home from school. During this time, my mother started complaining that when she got home from work, the receiver of the phone, an 80s style corded push-button phone, next to her bed was left off the base. I wasn't using the phone, but she would insist I must have because the phone was hung up properly when she left for work. One day, I got home a little early. Now, I need to pause and tell you about the layout of our apartment. From the front door, I looked directly into the living room, the dining room, the door to the kitchen, and the short hallway that led to my parents' bedroom and my bedroom. There was no other door, the windows were old-fashioned narrow casement windows with screens, and we were on the third floor. Anyway, as soon as I walked in the door, I clearly heard 2 footsteps in my parents' bedroom. I dropped my school bag and foolishly ran to the bedroom. It wasn't far and took only a few seconds. I got to the bedroom, and no one was there. However, I immediately noticed that the receiver of the phone on my mother's bedside table was on the floor. It was placed so that the cord to the base was stretched out as far as it could go. I later tried to replicate the placement by shaking the table, tipping the phone, etc. I could never get the receiver off the base. When I finally resorted to knocking it off with a finger, it would fall on the table or next to it. The only way I could replicate the placement of the receiver where I found it was to carefully stretch the cord, place it, and hold it for a few moments. It could not have gotten to that spot by accident. When I found the phone, I hung it up, and it immediately rang. I answered it, and it was my dad. He asked what was wrong. I asked him why he asked. He said he had called, apparently just before I got home, and someone, he thought it was me, answered the phone but never said anything. He finally hung up and had been trying to call back and only got through after I hung up the phone. I've never figured out what happened. I definitely heard footsteps, and I'm just as certain there was no one there. No one went by me. The windows in the bedroom were not disturbed, and my parents had too much stuff under the bed and in the closet for anyone bigger than an infant to hide in either spot. Also, after this, my mother never found the phone disturbed again. I went to college in Providence, Rhode Island. My dorm room was my roommates and mine, with beds on opposite sides of the room and desks by the foot of the bed, the usual dorm setup. Anyway, my boyfriend and I were hanging out in my room one day, and he was lying on my bed. I was up next to the bed and bent over to grab something. I heard him scream and freak out, holding his eyes, not exaggerating, and he wouldn't tell me why. Eventually he tells me that when I bent over, he saw a shadow behind me that actually kind of looked like him, and it freaked him out. He had an afro, so the silhouette would have been pretty distinctive. We didn't really talk about it afterwards and never told my roommate, she wasn't in the room. A couple of weeks later, I'm asleep in bed with my boyfriend. I wake up in the middle of the night to my roommate packing a bag, clearly panicked. She kind of rushed out of the room and didn't see me awake, so I didn't say anything. The next morning I see her and ask her why she rushed out of the room in the middle of the night. She then tells me she woke up in the middle of the night and saw my boyfriend sitting at my desk and asked him why he was up. She then saw my boyfriend sleeping next to me. She believed in ghost stuff, so she freaked and left. It really freaked me out because we hadn't mentioned the lookalike my boyfriend saw to her, and it sounded like she saw the same figure. Living in Re made me see some weird shit. There was this abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, like 30 minutes of backroads to find it and no other people for at least 10 miles in any direction. I and some friends used to go check out this spooky house and show it off to 1 or 2 new folks at a time. We did this 3 or 4 times, and as we were pulling up one night, a light in the house turned on. The house didn't have power any time we'd been there, and there were no vehicles anywhere around the house that night. Scared us all to the point none of us ever went back. In retrospect, it was probably being used as a hunting cabin or meth house, although there was never any indication of either that we saw, and they probably just had the breaker off when they weren't there. A car could have been parked behind in a place we couldn't see from the road, but as high school kids, nope. Spooky house with unexplained lights. The thing with eyes on its chest. Yes, I know the title sounds weird, but hear me out. Let me give a brief introduction. I'm from the northeastern part of India. Many things happened in the small town where my grandma's house is. I'm skeptical because I need to see a demon floating above the ground to actually believe it, but I doubt if I still will. So last night my family was having a conversation in the bedroom, and then the conversation suddenly turned into a paranormal one. It's rare when they talk about this type of thing. My sensitive aunt told me so many stories. First, I didn't believe her so much, but it was okay. Then my dad wanted to tell a story, and I was shocked because surely he was a logical person. He said that he and one of his friends were invited to a party in the cabin in the woods. Great, a typical setting for a horror movie. I thought the party was hosted for the celebration of the opening of a new business of one of the employers of my dad's friend. So as they went there, they missed the party, and they had to stay there at night. The cabin was rented out all night, so no problem, but there weren't so many people. So at night, at 3 a.m., I know it's the bad hour or something even here. So at 3 a.m. my dad and his friend had to use the bathroom, and excellent enough, the plumbing was broken in the bathroom, so they had to use another bathroom that was located somewhere far away from this cabin near some banana tree. Now remember this detail. You can see the bathroom from the cabin, though. So his friend was watching him from near the porch light. As my dad was doing his business, he felt the whole bathroom move. It was just a small block for a bathroom. I know it sounds weird, but these were common before, so as he looked around him, he didn't see anything. So he did his business and came and asked his friend why it shook even if it wasn't windy. The friend pointed towards the side of the bathroom. He saw a tall black figure, not like a human, it was way too high, just looking towards the woods, and its back was facing towards them. So as the figure did some motion, the bathroom used to move because a beam of it was attached to the banana tree. It was weirdly built. He asked why his friend didn't warn him, and his friend said he didn't want him to be scared. He said it felt like whatever it was didn't notice that my dad was there. That night they just packed their bags and drove off. The friend didn't even go about his business that night. Later they learned that that place, particularly where the bathroom is, was a burial ground. Someone built a bathroom over it for God knows what reason. Then, my aunt wanted to tell me a story. She calls herself sensitive, and I don't know how much I believe her, but she surely has a good intuition. She once sensed, I don't know how to put this, but she once sensed a snake was about to bite him, and one surely was. My grandma also witnessed the event, so the place she lived in before she had bought her own house was haunted, at least according to her. She said every night she would hear walking in the evening hours on the ceiling, and then the footsteps lead to one direction, then another, and they were heavy. So as my aunt and my uncle were doing their evening chores one day, they heard the sound of a plastic bag above the ceiling, meaning the roof. There wasn't any attic. So as they heard, my aunt suggested to sage the surroundings of the house, as she said that her brother also came in the house to deliver some food my grandma had made. They told him everything, and once again, as she said to sage the house, as soon as she said, the thing was with them. She could sense it. The room was filled with a real unpleasant smell, indescribable. Now she was angry. She stood alone in the house while my uncle and her brother saged around the house, and as they completed whatever it was, punched hard on the window, leaving a crack, and ran off. The thing did come few times. Like one time there was a long thing watching her through the window like a snake, and one day when she was watching some clothes outside the house near the water pump. A thing with no head and its eyes on its chest was watching her closely, literally feet away from her. She said she was scared, but calmly she called her husband, and they went inside the house. I know it sounds so weird, I don't think weird's the right word, but I don't know. One odd detail is that where the house was located, there were banana trees in the backyard. Now again, to my dad's stories. He said as a kid my dad and his friends were really outdoorsy kids, but they were asked not to go near a particular tree on the intersection near their house. People said there was a thing with no head and eyes on its chest, again, near the tree or attached to the tree, and by coincidence or some mystical fate, the tree was a ding-ding right. A banana tree, why banana trees? My dad and his friends did indeed see it a few times, and they described it exactly as my aunt had. He mentioned that they had cut down the tree to construct a hotel. The thing moved near one of his friend's dad's shops. So as people used to go to the shop, they would always see this thing and never saw anything but a pig running. My dad said, I don't think it was a pig, there were many farms but not here, and it was too faded and fast to be a pig or even an animal. So one more time he and his friend were digging a hole to actually put a pole for some sort of tent for an event or something. I can't recall what he said properly. So as they were digging just in the woods near their house, his friend discovered bones, actual human bones. That place where they stayed and many of my cousins too had a rough history. They don't have much info about it, though. They undid everything and decided not to continue further. Can you blame them? They came and chilled till night. When they heard something outside the house, they chased after it. They couldn't find anything. When they heard the footsteps on dried leaves just in front of them, they moved their torch lights where the footsteps were coming from, but they didn't see anything. He said they can see the leaves and even hear the footsteps but couldn't see anything walking. They bolted, not knowing what to do. I think those are the events related to the thing with its eyes on its chest or those banana trees. This is the scariest thing that happened to me. I can remember like it was just yesterday. It was the summer of 2004. I was 11 years old, and I hated the thought of going back to school. Being that school was closely approaching, I had a back-to-school related nightmare that I promptly woke up from. When I woke up, I remember hearing someone walking around in my room. At first I brushed it off because I thought it could be my mom or brother, but then I smelled the strong scent of cigarettes, and it freaked me out because no one in my house smoked at the time. I peeked and saw a shadowy figure of a man standing in front of my window looking out of it, and immediately I pretended to be asleep. I thought it was a burglar. The man must have noticed me and came to my bedside. He sat at the corner of my bed, and I could feel him looking at me. My body felt paralyzed. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, cry, anything, but I couldn't. He then grabbed my wrist as if he were checking my pulse. His touch felt like fire. I never felt anything like it before or after that. Then he came up to my ear and said something, but I don't know what he said. It was an entirely different language. His breath burned to the touch of my neck and ear, but I still couldn't move. The smell of cigarettes was even stronger now. He then left my room, and I could hear him turn left towards the bathroom next to my sister's room. What I heard next has been etched in my memory ever since. He laughed, but his laughter was so distorted. Not like the demonic laughs you hear in scary movies or anything. It was like a wheeze and a combination of many different voices. The laugh was bassy, high-pitched, and in between. It scared me so much, and no one else in the house woke up to hear it. We had outdoor dogs, and they started barking right after. The next day, I told my mom what happened, and I told her I thought someone broke into the house. We had locked all the doors and windows. Whatever it was came from inside the house. I had nightmares there nearly every night up until we moved a year later. My brother told me when we first moved there in 1997, he would hear loud footsteps and banging sounds from the attic. The only way to the attic was from a pull-down ladder in his room, and the way up there was sealed shut so no one could go up or down without first breaking off the plaster and paint from the ceiling entrance. Recently, I drove my sister to Vote, and on the car ride there, she told me she would hear things in her room such as whispering, heavy breathing, and weird crap altogether. My mom also said she saw what looked like what she described as a huge rabbit animal with human eyes standing in the hall staring right at her that shook her to the core. She had been alone in the house while everyone else was either in school or doing their own thing. Needless to say, all of us had an experience in that house. After we moved, no one really lived there for too long. Eventually, they tore down the house, leaving only the empty plot where it once stood. I'm not typically one to believe in the supernatural, but something happened to me a few years ago that I still can't explain. Even thinking about it now gives me chills, and I've often wondered if someone out there might have experienced something similar. Here's my story. I was on a road trip with a couple of friends, headed to a small town known for its scenic mountains and forests. We were planning to camp out in a clearing not far off the main trail to watch the stars and just get away from city life for a few days. Everything was going well. We reached the clearing just before dusk, set up our tents, and got a fire going. The atmosphere was just perfect, and we felt completely isolated from the rest of the world, which was exactly what we wanted. Around midnight, the conversation started winding down, and the forest was completely quiet except for the occasional crackle of our fire. We were starting to get sleepy when I suddenly heard what sounded like faint, distant music. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but I noticed my friend looking around too. I asked him, "Do you hear that?" He nodded, looking just as confused as I felt. We strained our ears, trying to place the sound, and realized it was coming from deeper in the forest, beyond where our firelight could reach. It was a strange, melodic humming, almost like a lullaby. The weird part was how it seemed to echo around us as though we were in a large, hollow room. We thought maybe some other campers had brought a radio or something, but the music didn't sound modern or even like any genre I'd ever heard. It was haunting and beautiful, yet it had this deeply unsettling quality. We debated investigating but ultimately decided against it. It was late, we were in an unfamiliar forest, and we didn't have a strong enough light to make it far. So, we sat there, listening to the eerie music, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. It kept going, growing louder, almost like it was getting closer, but we still couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. Then something really bizarre happened. All at once, the fire suddenly dimmed, and the whole clearing felt cold, like someone had sucked all the warmth out of the air. The music was clearer now, and it was almost as if it was coming from all directions. My friend whispered, "I think we should go back to the car." He didn't have to tell me twice. We quickly grabbed our essentials, left the rest, and started moving back toward the trail. As we hurried through the dark, the music seemed to follow us, fading and growing louder in waves, almost like something was pacing us from a distance. At one point, I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the trees, a shadow that didn't quite match any of the natural shapes. We finally made it back to the car, locked ourselves in, and drove back to the nearest town without looking back. When we went back the next morning to grab the rest of our gear, everything was exactly as we'd left it, but the clearing felt different somehow, like something had been disturbed. Even in broad daylight, I felt like we weren't alone. To this day, I can't explain what we heard that night. We've tried rationalizing it as maybe a strange echo or another group of campers playing music, but no one in town had seen or heard anything unusual that night, and the nearest campsite was miles away. I've since talked to other people who enjoy camping or hiking in remote places, and while some have strange stories, no one's described anything quite like this. Part of me wonders if it was just some shared hallucination or a trick of the mind, but we all heard it, and we all felt the cold, hollow feeling in the clearing. I still don't know what to make of it. My very first job was as a radio DJ at a small hometown radio station in the mid-1990s. This was a tiny building out in the middle of a field with a 500-foot antenna out back and a single road from the main road to the front door. The transmitter was right behind my studio, behind sound dampening glass, and had a light bulb that was always on. The station was tiny that you could see the light bulb in the transmitter room all the way from the driveway/roadway. There were only two doors, the front door and the back door in the transmitter room. That door didn't even have a handle on the outside, and it was always locked from the inside. It's impossible to enter that door from the outside. I worked the evening shift, from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. After my shift, we actually went off the air for the night. I was always the last person there, so after I went off the air, I had to pull commercials for the first hour or two of the morning show, clean dishes, finish up some production work, etc. After working there for a year or so, I had racked up a couple of weird experiences. Shadows scurrying about at the corner of my vision. Lights turning off and on. One evening, after getting in and taking over the board, I was just sitting there preparing myself mentally for the next 5 hours. I looked up, out the studio doors, towards the front door, and I saw the perfect shadow shape of a man who was probably 6 tall. It was there, then not. I went to my boss, who was not a nice person on her nicest days, and said, "So, I have a weird question." She sighed and looked at me, expecting who knows what. "Have you ever felt like someone was here who wasn't?" My boss yelled across the building for someone to come into her office. When that person arrived, she tilted her head at me. "He's seen Jimmy." Supposedly, everyone had seen Jimmy, the original owner of the radio station. "He popped in from time to time. He won't hurt you. He's just checking in on the station." So, from then on, Jimmy would make his appearances. His was a harmless presence. My studio faced another, unused, workspace, and he would flash the lights on and off a few times. I'd say, "Hi, Jimmy. Everything's going well." And it would stop. He turned a water faucet on once. He whispered my name in my ear one night, which freaked me out. At least, I think it was him. You see, there was another malevolent being that also lived there at the station. It didn't have a name, and it was about shin high. This one always gave me a really bad feeling. It was the one who would dart beside me, its shadow just in the corner of my eye. I always knew it was there, just because I would feel downright freaked out. One night in particular was the scariest I've ever been. Here it is, 30-ish or so years later, and I still can't explain it. As soon as everyone left the building for the night, I got that feeling like it was there. I just turned on all the lights, turned the music up, and tried to ignore it. The longer the night went on, though, the worse it got. Lights were flashing everywhere. A dot matrix printer in the sales office started going on its own, something that never happened. And that office was locked. Then, ceiling tiles started moving up as if someone hit them with a broom handle. They started closest to me from my studio, down the hall, and ended at the front door, which was locked. Then, the front door opened. A locked ducking door opened. I went down the hall to close and relock it. When I did, I saw through the door window that there was a coffee cup and a cigar on the front stoop. There was no reason for them to be there. On my way back to the studio, I got a big burst of cigar smell, like an invisible smoke cloud, right in my face. I knew my usual duties were required, but I didn't care at this point. I went off the air, grabbed my keys, and noped right the duck out of there. I ran to my car, backed up, and looked through the front door. A figure was standing inside, silhouetted in front of the transmitter light. I peeled out and went straight home. Now, all of that is screwy. But it's not the most unexplainable thing. Is it 100% impossible that someone didn't somehow sneak in and play a very elaborate prank on me? No. There's a slight, minuscule chance someone did, but to this day, I don't know how. It was an old, tiny building. But I still hold the possibility that it could have been a prank. I got home and told my mom this whole story. My heart was still pounding. She was all, shooey, well, it's bedtime. So, I go to my bedroom and dial up a BBS to write someone what had happened to me. As I was typing up the story, my modem speaker turned on. If you are old enough to remember dial-up modems, you know the speaker doesn't just turn on once the connection is made. They wouldn't even turn back on if someone in the house picked up the phone. You'd just get a lot of bad data on the screen, and your modem would disconnect. The speaker turns on, and a voice comes from the speaker, mixed with the static of the data connection. It screeched, "Hell peep me." The speaker then turned off, and nothing else changed on my screen. That speaker turning on and the voice coming out is solidified in my brain. I remember the screech like it was yesterday. I have no explanation for it. My mom was the only other person in the house, and she wouldn't have done something like that. She couldn't have done something like that. It was the scariest night of my life. I am as skeptical as you can be about anything ghost or UFO related, but that night is beyond my ability to explain. As kind of a footnote to all of this, I go back to that station every now and then when I go home to visit. I still know some people who work there. Jimmy is still active and is well known among the staff. The little scary one? No one else has reported seeing him. My roommate and girlfriend have had encounters with my potential doppelganger, and I need answers. For these encounters, I will need to provide some background information about the house I am living in. I live in a shared house with 9 other people. It's a big house having 5 floors that are split into 2 separate apartments, and we are all long-term friends that live in this house, including my girlfriend. First encounter. For context, my girlfriend lives in the downstairs apartment and has a bedroom in the basement. We were all in the lower apartment just chilling out and having a few drinks and watching some movies. This was back in like 2021-22. It started to get extremely late, and I and my girlfriend were getting tired, so we said goodnight and headed to her room in the basement and fell asleep. When I woke up the next day, my friend who lives on the floor underneath me asked what I was doing last night just standing on the stairs looking at him. I asked him what he was talking about as I was super confused, and he explained that when he had gone to bed around 3 to 4 a.m., he walked up the stairs that led to his room and said I was just standing motionless on the stairs in my boxers just looking at him. He said he thought nothing of it because he thought I was just going to the toilet or something, which is next to his room, and he gave me a nod and went to bed. I explained to him that I stayed in my girlfriend's room all night and even woke up there in the morning and that I had not gone all the way up to my room for anything that night. Furthermore, in order for me to exit the lower apartment and walk up to my room, I would have had to walk past everyone that was still up chilling in the living area, which did not happen. Not only that, hypothetically, even if I was a ninja while sleepwalking, I do not have a house key for the lower apartment, so for me to get back into my girlfriend's room, I would have to get someone to open the door for me, and I don't sleepwalk. After all of this, we just chalked it up to him being tired and seeing something that wasn't there. However, that does not sit right with me and him still to this day. Second encounter. This encounter happened a few months after the first. My girlfriend was in the lower apartment living area just chilling out on her phone at 1 a.m. She did this because I play in video game communities that do their events in a different time zone, and she would go downstairs as to not disturb what I was doing. During this time, she fell asleep on the sofa, and after my event, around 3:30 to 4 a.m., I headed downstairs to go and see her. She had propped her apartment door open so I could come down whenever I was finished, and she wasn't on the sofa. I assumed she got worn out and had gone to bed, so I went downstairs to her bedroom, where I found her sleeping in bed. She woke up from her sleep when I entered the room, and after a few minutes, she thanked me for coming down and taking her to bed. I explained that I had never come down during my event and I didn't take her to bed and that me being in the room now was the first time I had come down. She looked confused and explained to me that apparently she had fallen asleep on the sofa, and I had woken her up and told her, "You can't sleep down here, you should go to bed," and then took her downstairs to her bed and put her to sleep. I asked her if I had just left after that, and she said she didn't know, as she fell asleep very fast after getting into bed. I then told her the story of the first encounter because I was spooked, and let's just say we both got royally spooked together but just kind of put it to the back of our minds and forgot about it. The reason I am sharing this and remembering these encounters now is because I recently learned about doppelgangers, or people that look and try to act like you, and it gives me goosebumps. I asked my girlfriend about what she thinks about everything today when I told her I was going to make a post here, and she said she didn't know. I told her to ask her mom. My girlfriend's mom is religious, and my girlfriend said her mom told her about jinn, a spirit acknowledged in Islam, that can transform into a human. Honestly, I have no idea what this could be, and it baffles me every time I think about it, so any help or answers would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, all. Years ago I was renting a unit in an old building with a mate. It was a cool place, located across the road from the beach, in Australia, and the rent was cheap. Happy days. The first few months were pretty uneventful. The only thing that happened was I got locked out one night without my phone or keys when he was at his girlfriend's. The door kinda closed on its own, but it wasn't a huge holy shit, the place is haunted moment. That came later. One night, I and my mate are at the pub, and his GF let herself in after she finished work. We get a phone call telling us to stop being shits and that other people live in the building. Not having a clue what she was on about, we carried on at the pub. When we got back, we walked through the door to see a look of shock on her face. She couldn't believe we had come in through the front door, because apparently there was such a commotion in the garage. Each unit had a garage underneath. She assumed it was us being shitheads. This led to her making a phone call while we were in the pub. My mate explained where we'd been, and we checked on the garage, which was empty. She swears there's something going on in there, so she avoided coming back. Myself and my mate were a little creeped out by this, but thought nothing of it. And looking back, after this garage incident, there were a few very minor things that would happen around the house, like things being in places you would never put them, etc. Then it happened. Funnily enough, it was the night my mate convinced his GF to come back over. I have to set this up. The couch faced the TV, which was against a wall. Above the TV, my mate had a framed The Clash poster. So we have finished dinner and have all sat down to watch TV. Normal weeknight. All of a sudden, with no warning, the framed poster above the TV starts to creak. It then dislodges off the hook it was mounted on and begins to float outward. Towards us. It stops in the space between the TV and coffee table, hangs for another second or two before it drops, smashing over the floor. All three of us were out of there in a flash. My mate stayed at his missus's, I stayed at my sister's, and we cancelled the lease the next day. When we told the real estate, they didn't care. It was almost as if they were expecting it. Weird thing that happened during Halloween in our basement 1 to 2 years ago. I know this sounds fake because it happened during the days that led up to Halloween, but this is definitely real, and it shook my family for a while, although it's not very scary and sounds like the beginning of a trash horror film. Around the second week before Halloween, the cameras set up in my basement detected activity, and so did our motion sensors in the middle of the night around 12 p.m. We would later call the police and notify them that there may be an intruder in our basement. Our camera didn't show any movement, however. The police officer would enter the basement to find that there was no one there, and we went to bed. The occurrence would happen again at night. The same thing happened except later in the night, around 1 a.m. Basement cameras and motion detection caught something. We'd call the police again, and nothing would come up. So context here before I continue, we use an Apple Home system, and we have an Apple TV. If anyone is ringing the doorbell or if there's activity in our living room, the camera footage will pop up on our TV. In this case, every evening and night. The basement camera would show detection and footage on the TV, but we didn't see squat. It always popped up on our screen 2 to 3 times a day. It was on October 31st, Halloween, that my parents started becoming fearful. Being the heavily religious Hindus they are, they stuck the Siri Home Pod downstairs to play the Hanuman Chalisa or our version of warding off evil downstairs on repeat. The activity never came back again. I can go down into the basement without fear now, thankfully. The strange thing is that our house is brand new. It was constructed a mere 4 years ago, so no one had lived here prior. Additionally, we had experienced zero paranormal activity prior to this. Nowadays, I and my family laugh it off, and I have a story to tell to people, but then it was pretty scary in my first paranormal experience. I really wish I knew what was happening in my basement. The late night encounter. So this takes us back to the spring of 2017 or 2018. I never really slept as much back then, I always had full-on energy all the time. For example, I will stay up until midnight and fall asleep till I wake up out of nowhere at 3 in the morning. This took place with the same scenario where I went to bed around 11 p.m. and fell asleep watching some YouTube videos. I woke up, and it was around 2 a.m. I wanted to use the bathroom and went to reach my glasses. Then I was walking into the bathroom and I froze completely in my tracks. It felt like someone was in front of me, without knowing there was something there, and I saw it. This figure was pure black with horns and white eyes. I didn't make out a mouth at all. The aura around this figure was black, splurging all over like it was black paint and black colored fire spreading all over it. It just kept staring at me. I was kind of in this daze, walking slowly towards it, but then it just flew a few inches upward and vanished like dust. Then I snapped out of it and felt really tired and lightheaded after whatever it was left my room. I was so tired, after what happened, I just blacked out on my bed. Therefore, I woke the next morning with the worst ever headache and swirling stomach, but this went away after an hour or two. Thanks for listening to my true encounter. This isn't my story, it's my uncle's. A bit of backstory: he used to work on the London Underground doing maintenance on the tracks, tunnels, etc. Once he went into a tunnel with two other colleagues. They'd stopped to do something, and this man said to my uncle, like, "Hey, uncle's name, can you show me the way out?" My uncle, thinking it was one of his guys, said, "You know the way out." I think he was so engrossed in his work that he didn't turn around to see this bloke to start with. So this guy says, "I'm so cold," and then my uncle said he immediately felt dead cold and the air around him dropped. Not sure what he meant by that. So my uncle turns round and shines a light on him. My uncle said to me this bloke is what he would call a ghost standing there. He was holding a really old/vintage lamp and wearing a really old, dirty uniform. He said the feeling he got was so strange as if he knew this bloke was a ghost. The bloke just kept saying over and over again, "I'm so cold. I'm so cold." My uncle eventually said to this guy, "I don't think you're supposed to be here, mate. Can you see a light anywhere?" And he looked dead at my uncle and said, "Can you help me? I'm so cold." I'm unsure if the colleagues came to see who my uncle was talking to, but one of them tried to approach this bloke thinking it was someone in their team playing a joke, and this bloke just disappeared right in front of their eyes. All of them panicked and fled the scene. They refused to go back into the tunnel. My uncle and two colleagues refused to go down that tunnel again. Some other colleagues have said they've seen this bloke, and he always says how cold he is. My uncle's retired now but says he thinks of this bloke from time to time. This story has rattled around in my brain for years and years. I'm not a believer in much, but my so and I were recently watching some of those corny top 5s, and I brought up this whole thing from my childhood, and I still have no explanation, so here it goes, I guess. I live in a very rural town in Michigan. Like so rural, the population is easily 50% Amish. Our house at the time was pretty out of town. We lived on something like 20 acres of land. Pure fields and forest behind my house. No streetlights on this road or anything because it was dirt, and that's just pretty common there. I was 14 at the time, and it was a few days after my birthday, so midwinter. I had gotten a new PC, and my mother and I were both playing EverQuest. We kept the computers in the same room. It was kind of the way we spent time together. The computer room was right off the front door. Like you'd walk into the house and be right facing that room, and the house was pretty small. But we were doing a raid that night. It was like really late that night, between 11 and midnight, maybe later, and out of nowhere these loud knocks just bang on the front door. Like 3 to 4 knocks. Super loud. We looked over at the door, and bang, like 3 more knocks. My mom and I just kind of look at each other, and she goes, "So you heard that too?" Dude, my stomach flipped because, like, ick, right? I go to the door, I stand there for a few, and I open it, and nothing. Not a soul. And for a second my brain was like, prank, whatever. Then I look down and there's snow all over the porch, and it's perfect, untouched snow. No footprints, no marks at all. There was this wheelchair ramp, one of the really long, gentle slope ones, all the way to the driveway and nothing. Not a single mark. My mom and I still talk about it occasionally, and it weirds her out big time. Now here's some weirdness my brain didn't connect to until I was talking to my so about it. Outside of this house is this massive tree, like huge. And one of the big sections of the tree had been cut off, like a whole third of the tree where it branches off from the trunk. I wish I had pictures because it's weird. But my friend and I had been just sitting under a tree later in the year, spring or summer, I'm not sure, but it was nice enough to sit in the grass. We had this old dude who rode up and down the road on a mobility scooter. He lived maybe a quarter mile up the road. He pulled over on the side of the road and called me over there, and he asked me if I lived there. I said yes, and then without missing a beat, this dude asks me if I knew the tree we were sitting under is where someone died. I just kind of stood there, and he pointed to where the tree had been cut and said that the old owner's kid hung himself there. Then he rode away, just kind of talking to himself. My friend left because she was freaked out. Now I don't know if what he said actually happened. I never dug into it, but dude was always up and down the road yelling, singing, and talking to himself. Weird experience from 25 years ago that I can't forget. Okay, So this is a weird one that I figured I'd share here because I really can't think of a better place. The summer before I turned 16, a friend of mine was moving away. It was just him, his older brother, and their mom sharing an apartment near my house. For whatever reason his mother needed to go ahead of them to their new residence, she left my friend and his older brother at the apartment on their own for basically the entire month of June. We were the worst kids, I guess you could say, getting drunk and smoking weed all the time at our young age. And we decided to send him off with one hell of a celebration. Almost every night that June, our friend group would sneak out of our houses and head over to his place. And we partied hard from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. until 4 to 5 a.m. Well, as the weeks went on, our friend group started having more and more trouble reaching his apartment and then home later in the night while avoiding the cops. Our town was well known for having overzealous cops who would love to bust us for curfew and or public intoxication. I had a pretty cool solution, or so I thought. His apartment complex was directly behind my house with a small forest that had a deep ravine with a small creek running through it separating my neighborhood from his apartments. I decided to just cut through the forest. Most nights it was well lit by the moon, the creek was only a foot deep, and it was easy to just hop over, so it was perfect to cover my tracks. And it worked great for multiple weeks until one of the final nights partying at his place. My brother decided to join me this time, and everything went well. It was a normal night like any other until it was time to go home. When we left the apartment around 4 a.m., we stepped outside and immediately found ourselves cold and walking into a crazy thick fog. The cold was weird because it was nearly July. But the fog was the most unnerving part. We could barely see a few feet in front of us. It was, to this day, the heaviest fog I've ever personally seen. Still, fog be damned, we needed to get home. The apartment complex, all the lit up windows and streetlights, everything was so familiar it didn't slow us down in the slightest heading towards the forest. He and I were walking, talking about the events of the night, and entered the forest on a well-established trail that basically everyone who lives in the area regularly uses. So it was well defined. Shortly after entering the forest, the trail begins to descend down the ravine to the creek, which we easily stepped over. What happened next is where things went sideways for us. As we hiked up the hill on the other side of the ravine, we reached the top and were greeted with the most horrific sight I've ever seen. Hundreds of small, white, semi-translucent creatures everywhere. They looked kind of like gremlins or deformed gnomes or something. They were standing behind the trees and in the bushes at ground level, hanging and swinging from the high tree branches above us. All moving around erratically, and even though we couldn't make out their faces, it seemed like they were focusing on us. We froze at the top of that hill. Unsure what to do, I looked behind, thinking of maybe making our escape back down the way we came. But we couldn't. They were there now too. We were surrounded. My younger brother, terrified, whispered in nearly a yell, "Are you seeing this? What the duck are they?" I replied in the same freaked out manner that I had no idea. After a minute more, the creatures seemed like they were getting closer. I grabbed his arm and pulled him. We took off running straight through them. Never actually making physical contact with any of these things. A few minutes later we were out of those woods and on a dead-end street in our neighborhood well lit by streetlights. We switched to a swift walk and made our way home. Discussing those creatures the whole way. Neither of us is sure what the hell we just saw. We decided not to ever talk about it again. But I couldn't keep it in. It was eating away at me. A few weeks later I was hanging out with another one of our friends from the group. He lived in the opposite direction and was at the party that night and left shortly after we did. I told him, "Man, I need to tell you something. We saw something weird heading home from the party the other night." I thought it was weird how quickly that caught his full attention, but he stopped whatever he was doing and listened. After explaining what we saw, his eyes went wide, and he told me he wasn't going to say anything. But he saw them too on his way home. In the darkness of a park across the street from his house. Over the years I've searched Google a few times whenever the memories of that night hit me. But I never find anything about creatures like the ones we saw. I should mention our town and, more specifically, that area once belonged to a Native American tribe. It's even named after them. So I'm not sure if that had anything to do with it. But I've never seen them before, or since. And I'd really like to know if anyone has the slightest idea what they could have been. This has been bothering me for 25 years. Not kidding. During my first sleep paralysis experience, a shadow figure took a hit of my nicotine puff bar. To give context, I have recently been going through some personally stressful times and was only able to sleep for about 2 hours in the last 3 days. The night it happened, I had gotten home from work around 5 p.m., and just from pure exhaustion from not sleeping and working all 3 of those days, I knocked out around 6. My body woke me up for a water break at around 1 a.m., but I was still extremely exhausted and decided to go back to sleep. Before my SP experience, I remember having a nightmare and waking up briefly around 2:30 a.m. and quickly falling back to sleep after I calmed myself down. Now, let's move on to the actual experience. A text I sent my friend group at 2:57 a.m. about the situation pretty much confirms that this probably happened around 20 minutes after I fell back asleep. I remember my eyes opening, me lying on my side, and every detail in my room being down to a T. Now the only thing out of place was this all-black, shadow-like figure. The best way I could describe it is how it looks like in a video game when you haven't unlocked a character, just standing in front of me, just staring at me. At first I didn't freak out because I thought maybe it could have been my dad, as he typically will walk into my room late at night to see if I'm sleeping. Don't ask me why, he's just a very suspicious person. But that's when this figure put his hand on, the side of my hip and kind of ran his hand up to about where my rib cage is, and I remember physically feeling it. When I tried to lay up to figure out what was going on, not a single muscle in my body was able to move. That's when I saw this shadow figure take a couple of steps towards where my head was laying on my pillow. It proceeded to stick its hand under my pillow, and I remember it feeling literally as if someone stuck a hand under your pillow while your head was on it. It grabbed my nicotine puff bar, did about a 90 degrees turn left to where it wasn't looking at me anymore, and took a ducking hit of that shit. I wish I were lying. The craziest part is that I saw the little blue light at the end of the puff bar that turns on when someone takes a hit and goes off. That's when I finally, I guess, woke up. It felt like I opened my eyes again, but the details were too complex for it to be a dream. I was able to move again. I checked under my pillow, and my puff bar was still there, and that's when I sent a text to my group freaking out about what happened. I know it's a crazy story, but this really happened. My friend didn't believe me at first when I told him until he saw the genuine goosebumps and chills I got when he told me to search up sleep paralysis shadow man. That was pretty much my experience. I'm pleased to answer any questions in the comments. I wake up in the middle of the night feeling watched. I sit up slightly and glance at the door, noticing what appears to be a tall, dark figure standing there. I feel like whatever it is just reeks of pure malevolence. As I try to convince myself it's a dream, one of my cats hisses and I see them both standing on the bed, Halloween kitty-like with hair on end and backs arched. I am not a particularly religious person, but for some reason I say the words, I abjure you. May all the light and love in the universe drive you away. The figure turned and walked from the door. 2 nights later, I wake up feeling as though someone is watching me. I sit up, and this time it is a short black figure. I don't feel quite the malevolent intent coming from the figure this time, but I am still concerned. I look, and both cats are intently watching the door but not looking too upset. For some reason I just felt like I needed to lay back down. I do, and the next thing I know, this thing rushes to the end of the bed, and I feel like it is staring at me. It looked like it was wearing a hood. I freak out and sit up again, and whatever it is turns and runs out the door. I was shaking but wondering if this was a nightmare until my husband suddenly sits up and shouts, "What the hell was that?" He gets up and checks for intruders and finds nothing. Nothing like that happened the rest of the time we lived there. I've seen some pretty wild stuff in my life, but most of it is understandable. The one event that comes to mind was witnessed by my dad, brother, and myself, and it's a 2-part encounter, but I still consider it one event. It was around 1998, my family and I had just moved into an old clapboard house on the edge of town. It had a huge backyard with a 6-foot wooden privacy fence on one side and a metal chain-link fence about 4.5 feet high around the other 3 sides of the yard. Neighbors on one side, the privacy fence side, had a small grass alley that ran behind the back with a street light and then another yard, etc. Our bedroom was an old converted sunroom on the back of the house that faces the backyard. It had floor-to-ceiling windows all along the back wall looking into the backyard. We didn't have many options as to where to place our beds, so my headboard was against the windows, and my brother's bed was about 8 feet away with his headboard against the opposite wall with the foot of the bed facing the windows. One night we were up pretty late, I was in my bed, and he was in his, just talking about random things when suddenly he got quiet. I figured he fell asleep, but then I heard him whispering in a shaky breath, so I'm like, "What?" And I hear him whisper again. So again I'm like, "Speak up. I can't hear you," and he goes, "Don't move. And be quiet." In a forced whisper, but I, thinking he's messing with me, am like, "Why?" And I'm looking at him, mind you, my head is to the windows, and he's pointing into the backyard behind my bed. So quickly sit up and turn around and see this huge dog head staring almost nose to glass through the window right behind my bed. I'm almost nose to nose with this thing. Just a single pane of glass and about 10 inches of empty air separate me from this thing. Now when I say I screamed, I mean I screamed. Not my proudest moment, but hey, I was like 10 years old. Well, anyways, the thing quickly ducked under the window and then ran to the side of the yard and jumped the 4.5 feet chain link fence and bolted off into the darkness. My dad came running into the room with our mom right on his heels. We were able to get out that something was looking through our window. So dad ran back to his room and grabbed his shotgun and then headed out the side door of the house and into the backyard. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, he didn't find anything, wrote it off as I had a nightmare, and my brother wouldn't admit to seeing anything. So I took the blame and was told to quit messing around and go back to bed, typical parent response, etc. Well, later that night, maybe an hour or so later, after I begged my parents to let me sleep in the living room because leaving the house wasn't an option and still being refused, I was made to sleep in my room. So again my brother and I are in our room with these floor-to-ceiling windows, we are just completely rattled. We are both huddled in his bed, staring out the windows, when we see this thing come walking along the chain link fence on all fours, and the fence only comes up to its mid-shoulder, so this thing is huge. It sniffs the ground, does a few circles, and then hops the fence into the backyard like it's nothing. It walks over to the window and again gets its nose to the glass like it's trying to see in. We are panicking the whole time. Well, my brother is like, duck this, and as soon as he steps off the bed, we hear this loud bang, and there is a flash of light. The thing at the windows gets knocked sideways, and without even missing a beat, it turns and runs across the full length of the backyard, jumps the back chain link fence, clears the fence, the alleyway, and then lands in the back neighbor's yard. This is easily a 15 to 20 foot jump minimum, clearing their fence like it was nothing and was gone at a dead run, up beside that house and off into the darkness on the other side. My dad comes tearing around the side of the house with his shotgun in hand and makes a frantic dash for the side door and slams it shut behind him. He is screaming and hollering. We have to go. We pack up and head to a hotel that night. My mom absolutely refused to believe we saw what we said we saw, and we only lived there for about 6 months. It rattled my dad so much he didn't even want to come back. He told my mom that we were just going to move that next day, but she wouldn't allow it. After about 6 months she conceded, and we moved. Mind you, this is in the coastal plains region of Texas, and we have no large wild canines here. We have stray dogs and coyotes, but nothing that would even remotely touch on how big this thing was. My dad swears he shot that thing with a slug from about 15 feet away with his 12-gauge shotgun right underneath its left arm, hitting it in the ribs where its vital organs are, and nothing, it just ran off. He said the thing that freaked him out the most was that when he saw the thing jump the fence, it walked towards our window crouched but still on its hind legs. It wasn't walking on all fours, and then when it got to our window, it stood up straighter, and he could tell that while it looked like a dog, its body was shaped wrong. He said it looked like a really stocky person wearing a dog suit, but he could tell it wasn't a suit. Also, when it was walking in circles sniffing the ground before coming into our yard the second time, it wasn't actually sniffing the ground like for a scent. It was staring at our window with its face to the ground like it was acting like it was sniffing the ground, almost as if it was playing a part to see if anyone would notice it. He said he's had dogs his whole life, and everything about what it was doing was wrong. A while later I asked my dad why he was in the backyard if he thought I was having a nightmare, and he told me my brother is the one that gave it away. He said with how panicked I looked, my brother was almost white as a sheet and wouldn't take his eyes off the window. He said, "Your brother has never looked so scared and has never been one to just make stuff up." So after going back to his room with my mom, as he was lying there thinking about it, he decided that if my brother was as white as he was, then we had to have seen something. So he grabbed his gun in case he had to scare some creeper out of our yard and figured he was going to go through the garage and out by the far side of the house and sneak to the corner to see if someone was peeking in our windows or if someone was actually messing with us. He never actually thought we saw a huge dog-looking thing, just that maybe with it being dark outside and us being kids with overactive imaginations, maybe we just mistook someone as something. But when he saw that thing come up the side fence and with the streetlight in the back alley lighting up the backyard, he saw it, and it freaked him out. He was gonna creep back inside until it went up to our window, and he said as it stood up, he just got this instant feeling of just dread like something was gonna happen to us. Something happened to me when I was a kid that was deeply strange. The only people I've told are my wife and mom, who found out right away. I've never really felt comfortable telling anyone else about it, but I've been lurking on this channel for a while now, and it seems like a safe place to share. I also hope that by sharing it, I can maybe hear from others who might have had similar experiences, so I can gain insight about it from different perspectives. I'm 47 now, but this happened in 1983 when I was 7. At that time, I harbored a deep fear of the dark. I used to have awful nightmares, and they caused me a lot of anxiety. Whenever I had one of these nightmares, I'd end up going to my parents' room to sleep there. I was the youngest in the family, with 3 older brothers. The next one up from me was 7 years older, so there was quite a gap. We lived in a split-level house back in the 80s. All the bedrooms and bathrooms were on one side, split across 2 levels. The rest of the house, the living room, den, dining room, and kitchen, was on the other side, kind of cut off in the middle. Because of the age gap, my bedtime was a lot earlier than the rest of my family, so they'd all be in the living room watching TV while I had to go to bed alone in a different part of the house by myself. That's probably why I started this weird habit, something almost like OCD. To make sure there weren't any monsters or anything scary in the house when I went to bed, I had this whole routine. I'd start upstairs, opening all the closet doors and both bathroom shower curtains and leaving the light on in each room. Then I'd go downstairs, where my room was, and do the same thing, open all the closet doors and the bathroom shower curtain and leave all the lights on. Finally, in my own room, I'd open my closet door, leave my main door open, switch off my light, and then dash into bed, covering myself up completely, even over my head. I don't have a personal memory of this next bit, but my mom said that one day I came to her wanting help because I was scared of the dark. We prayed together, asking God to help me overcome my fear. My mom specifically mentioned that this prayer took place just a day before the following, an event that I remember very vividly, happened. I remember waking up in the middle of the night and seeing something really strange. There was this huge, dark figure, like a human but much, much bigger, sitting at the foot of my bed. It was enormous, its head almost reached the ceiling even though it was sitting down. Imagine someone as big as Andre the Giant, but even larger. Standing up, it would have had to stoop just to fit in a room with 8-foot ceilings. It was bulky. It had limbs, but they were more like forms than actual limbs. But it was humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a broad neck, and broad, sloping shoulders. It was sitting, hunched over with its head tilted, its trunk bending over with its elbows resting on its legs. Its knees were also kind of high, like it was a huge person sitting on the ground or a tiny chair, my bed. My room wasn't pitch dark. There was always a bit of light coming in from outside, enough to see the furniture and stuff. But this figure was different. It didn't have a 3D form. All this description was just from its silhouette, an outline without any depth or details in the middle, no eyes, no face, nothing. It was like a huge hole in the air. And the edges, even though I can describe its anatomy, were more like feelings than specific shapes. It's difficult to explain. Even though it had no eyes that I could see, I could tell it was watching me intensely. Now, here's the weirdest part. I wasn't scared at all while it was happening or any time since. You'd think, for a kid who was frightened of monsters, that he'd check every closet before bed. Seeing this giant shadowy figure would be terrifying. But it wasn't. I felt completely calm, peaceful, and safe. It was almost like it had the posture of a parent watching over a child, leaning forward slightly with its head tilted. And even now, as I write this, I can still remember those feelings. I know for sure that I wasn't dreaming. I was wide awake and completely aware that what I was seeing was real. It felt like this huge figure was there to watch over me, to guard me. That night, instead of heading to my parents' room like I usually did, I just went back to sleep. The next morning, I told my mom about it. Being a very charismatic Christian, she immediately said it was my guardian angel. That's what she believed in, and she still does. But this thing didn't look like any angel description or depiction I'd ever seen. It was more like a faceless, dark void shaped like a giant person. The only reason I thought it might be something good was that I felt no fear at all. However, you wouldn't typically consider a giant humanoid void to be on the side of good. Now, as an adult, I realize it sounds insane. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just backfilling the memory, but I can still remember it with complete clarity. My mom remembers me talking with her about it as a kid, and she believed me. What's more, after that night, I stopped my whole routine of checking closets and lights. I never went to my parents' room in the middle of the night again. I wasn't scared of the dark anymore, and my nightmares stopped. I've never had anything like that happen again, and I've never confused a dream with reality when waking up. As far as I can tell, this was a real, one-time event that permanently changed me. I don't really know what to think of it. When I was young, and even up to my 20s and early 30s, I reconciled the memory with the religious environment I was part of. But as I've drifted away from that belief system, I find myself fascinated by this memory and am discovering it difficult to reconcile. My journey has taught me that the world is more than our senses make it seem. With all the recent talk about UFOs, non-human intelligence, and encounters, I started thinking about this event again, so I decided to share it here. This place seems like the safest place to share my story semi-publicly. Please share if you have experienced anything similar. Anyone ever had an encounter such as this? My grandfather, for a large part of my life, was always the family believer and alien/UFO storyteller. I never truly believed until I would spend time around him and begin to notice the things he did, such as some night sky stars suddenly jetting off into the universe and disappearing. This particular encounter profoundly shaped my belief in their existence. He has a channel full of a bunch of his skeptical opinions and ideologies, but a focus of his channel pertains to his encounters and such. I can vouch for him, as he was my grandfather, so the anomalies and changes that followed the interaction with the gray, such as a change in the behavior of his pet dog. He had a black pit bull who was loving and respected our privacy. But when he snapped a pic of the gray peeking from his bathroom, she would always follow us to the bathroom and never let us be alone. All of these things together culminate to let me believe that this is very and truly real. I do not agree with most of his stances and beliefs, and I've been quick to realize whether he was being truthful or not and whether he was making his own fantasy within his own mind. But this first-hand experience is what made me believe because of how compelling it was. Was wanting to know if anyone else ever experienced anything like this before? I had at least 2 experiences with a dark void at the foot of my bed when I was a child. Unfortunately, neither provided a benevolent or peaceful feeling, but they were rather menacing and sinister and just plain terrified me. The first time I was about 7 years old, and my family stayed the night house sitting for a friend. My younger sister and I were in a pull-out couch bed in the living room and had been under the covers telling jokes and cracking up. Suddenly, we heard a rustling sound, and, though the lights were off and it was very dark, we saw a large figure at the foot of the bed that appeared to be 7 or more feet tall and fairly full-bodied. It was clearly not human because it looked like an oversized aardvark standing on its hind legs with long ears, a long snout, and wings. It was swaying back and forth in a fluid motion, playing what looked like its long nose, but probably a horn instrument of some kind. My sister and I were terrified and pulled the blankets over our heads. I peeked out once, and it was still there, and then about a minute later, it was gone. I ran and woke up my parents, and we described it to them. They said it was probably just the refrigerator making noise, and it scared us, so they didn't believe us. During my sophomore year in high school, frightening occurrences haunted my bedroom. At this time, I preferred my room to be pitch black because lights bothered me when trying to sleep. I had my windows and doors covered with material to keep the light out. So, every night, I would hear noises, see random lights, or feel something sitting or walking on my bed as though a cat were there. One particular night, I saw what appeared to be stars where my ceiling should be, and I heard a flapping noise and noticed a large, dark object fly over my head and land at the foot of the bed. It then slowly rose up to stand about 7 to 8 feet tall with no particular distinctive features. Just a black cape or robe stood there for a minute or so, and then it was gone. I had a paranormal experience that stayed with me for years. To start, I've always believed in such things as spirits, the paranormal, etc., in large part due to my family. Most in my family, especially the parents and grandparents, are religious, so I've always heard about spirits and what comes after life, but the biggest influence would be my father, especially when it came to the paranormal. He was such a big fan of the show Ghost Hunters that it was pretty normal to find him after work watching the show from his box set along with some other paranormal investigation shows and some stuff like Supernatural, and I would always watch these shows and movies with ghosts, vampires, werewolves, etc., and for so long it's been one of my biggest interests, even now that I'm almost 27. Ever since I was little, I've always wanted to see and learn more, and I believe I've had a few encounters, most pretty calm besides the initial startle, but one experience that stuck felt so aggressive. My family moved when I was young into a trailer park in Nebraska to be closer to my ailing grandmother when I was, I believe, 8 years old. I finished the school year in a new school, but things weren't so worrying being the new kid starting in the middle of the year since I had met 2 kids who were so nice and befriended me almost immediately, who coincidentally were my neighbors. One lived next door and the other one a road down from us. The following summer we'd go outside and play almost every day. Everything felt normal throughout the day with nothing eventful happening really. We played, we ran around, and eventually everyone got called home. It was nothing but a regular summer day for me. After dinner and some TV, it was starting to get late, so everyone went to bed. I lay down and, for a little while, rolled around and struggled to get comfortable. It just wasn't happening, and I wasn't exhausted anymore from fighting to get comfy, so I checked my alarm clock. I still remember it being a few minutes from 2 a.m., and I started thinking about getting up and playing on my old Xbox, thinking it'd burn a little energy and make me drained again. Just before I could sit up, there was a light tap on my wall directly behind my headboard. Just the one singular light tap, like someone thumped their finger against the wall. I thought maybe it was my mom, so I didn't budge so I could sneak a game in when she left. Then there was another, and another, until it very quickly turned to sounding like someone tapping all their fingers on my wall directly behind my head. Almost like when someone is thinking or annoyed and they quickly tap their fingers on their desk as an example. I still thought it had to be my mom, that somehow she knew I was awake, but it deeply, deeply felt off. The tapping got harder, it went from light taps to a harder, almost aggravated thumping. I was really starting to get scared when there was another thump, but it was to my left side, and I froze solid under the blanket. Opposite the wall to my left was one of those old school big screen TVs with the giant back that everyone hated to move. There was no way someone was tapping or knocking from that side, with the TV in the way. Then it started to my right in my brother's room, but I knew it wasn't him because he wasn't home that night. He was at a girlfriend's for the night. Almost in perfect sync, a very angry, aggressive banging started on the last wall, the one that faced outside, like someone wanting and really trying to beat the wall down, and the rest of the banging started to follow just as aggressively. All four sides sounded like rabid animals were just dying to break down the walls, itching to get to me, and it wouldn't stop. I started to hear this buzzing like noise above me, above the trailer. It reminded me of the noise people make to mimic a cheering crowd, but it was much deeper and scratchier. It just kept getting louder and louder until it was like it was in my head, buzzing and drowning out everything besides the banging and immense fear. It felt like I was surrounded in a trap with something truly awful staring down at me like a predator just beyond my reach, waiting for its opportunity. As sudden as it started, it just stopped. Everything went dead silent, but I was still frozen and terrified. As soon as it stopped, it felt like I could breathe, and I instantly broke into tears. I didn't feel those eyes on me anymore, and as soon as I felt comfortable enough, I quickly grabbed my clock. I was still too scared to uncover myself from the blanket, so I brought the clock to me under the blanket. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to check the time, possibly in the hopes that someone would awaken soon. That experience felt like a lifetime, but it had only been a few minutes. It started just a few minutes before 2, and when I looked, it was barely after 2. I exhausted myself crying, so eventually I did fall asleep, but I made sure to tell my parents the second I woke up. I'm sure like many with a childhood experience, it went in one ear and out the other, but I 100% believe this experience was very real and that something real was waiting for its chance. Thank you so much to everyone who listened to this. I'm not so much looking for answers as I was to share my experience, but it's something that's definitely interested me since it happened, so I'd love to hear if anyone else has had similar experiences to this. Paranormal encounters from childhood home. So this is kind of long, but I'll make it as short as possible. There were many different experiences in my last home. My mom bought the house when I was around 10. There was always an uneasy feeling throughout the house. I have 3 brothers, 2 of whom lived with us for a while. They are both older by at least 8 years. The older brother that stayed with us temporarily with his daughter and just had a mattress on the living room floor. One night he woke up and saw a little girl run through the living room and through the door that goes to the garage. He chased her at first sight thinking it was his daughter but turned around and she was still asleep. My other brother claimed he saw the chairs in the sunroom move by themselves and would often get locked out of the main house while he was in the room playing instruments. My cousin stayed with us for a time and slept in my room. I was too scared to sleep in there and would sleep on my mom's floor. He ran in the room freaking out and woke us up before he ran outside after claiming he heard a little girl screaming outside the bedroom window. Nothing was out there. My brother's friend stayed the weekend once and was sleeping on the living room couch one night and left during the middle of the night to walk home during the middle of December with no shirt or shoes after saying something was trying to suffocate him in his sleep. As for myself, I finally attempted to sleep in my own bedroom one night, and as I tried to sleep, I heard a penny drop in my closet, and then I saw my toy wrestling ring slide across the bedroom floor. I ran to wake my mom up and made her take us to a hotel for the night. My mom ended up getting married, and we moved out for a little bit. The marriage didn't work, and we ended up moving back, but after a few years, this time my girlfriend stayed with us, and I had my mom have a new bedroom built inside the garage because I was not sleeping in my old room. One night it was just me and my girlfriend. She had to go to the other side of the house to use the bathroom, and while walking back, she claimed she heard a little girl saying she's going to hell over and over, so she ran back to our bedroom in the garage, and when she was shutting the garage door behind her, she felt the door being yanked against her pull. Also, when I was younger, My mother says I raised up in the middle of my sleep and started speaking in a language she's never heard. We no longer live there and never plan on going back. Working in a nursing home for years during the night, everyone always complained of weird stuff like noises on the top floor. I never believed in any of that, so I was always the one going upstairs to do night checks. One night I was changing a resident on that floor with a colleague, and my colleague complained he heard something like people walking. We were in the resident room, and I had to go to the cupboard at the end of that corridor to get bed sheets, and when I was coming back with the bed sheets, I kept hearing steps and like if someone was touching and opening plastic bags. I was so annoyed and looked outside the room and saw a shadow passing the corridor. The issue is that the shadow was so big, like if literally a person just passed by along with step noises and plastic bags. I freaked out so badly and froze completely. I had to call another colleague to come upstairs because I was so scared of coming out of the resident room. Bear in mind that I do not believe in those things, and for 2 years I was always the one doing night checks on the top floor and bottom floor on my own. Never had any problem and never saw something. Since that day I never went upstairs alone and was always very scared. Something crawled into my bed. In 2018 I went to visit a friend that moved to Sweden, and I went during the holiday midsummer. FYI, it's nothing like the movie other than people singing and dancing around a maypole in a large field and having a barbecue with friends and lots of booze. There was no murder or hallucinogenics. My friend is a medium, but not the kind that purposely tries to connect with spirits, they just seek her out like she's some sort of beacon. She has experienced a range of encounters, from benign ones to violent ones involving physical attacks. I knew this going into the visit but didn't expect anything to happen while I was there, let alone have anything happen to me. I had been there almost a full week, and nothing major happened over that period of time other than we smelled roses and also cigarette smoke, which she associated with her father and grandmother, who had both passed. But my second to last night is when the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life as far as the paranormal goes happened. I had been sleeping on an air mattress in the spare bedroom, and because it was the end of the week, the mattress had started to deflate a little, so any movement was exaggerated. It was the middle of the night, and just as I was dozing off with my back to the door, I felt the side of the bed dip down as if someone were sitting on it and their weight was causing it to move. Then it felt like it laid down behind me as if to spoon me, and I got this feeling that an arm was draping over my body while they propped themselves up on an elbow and leaned over my face like they wanted to kiss me goodnight. Naturally I was trying to rationalize what was happening and thought maybe their cat, Zombie, had gotten into my room and jumped onto the bed, and that's why it dipped down. But it wasn't him because he's old, has a bum front leg, and can't climb the stairs. He also doesn't have opposable thumbs to open the bedroom door. Then I thought maybe it was my friend's brother who was visiting at the same time, but he had left 2 days ago. These thoughts all ran through my head in a brief amount of time before I realized I was alone and the door was still shut. I sat up so fast and turned on the bedside lamp to see that I was actually alone. I stayed awake the rest of the night with the light on until the sun came up. The sun never fully goes down in southern Sweden during the summer, so there was some light in the sky all night but not enough that I didn't need the light on. I went downstairs to wait for them to get up and told her boyfriend about what happened. He's skeptical, so I didn't get any validation until my friend woke up. Nothing else happened on the last day/night I was there. But we slept with our bedroom doors open, and I had the light on until I could get the duck out of there. I'm not 100% sure who or what visited me. It's possible it was my husband who died in 2014, and he had an opportunity to really visit since my friend tends to attract things that aren't in this realm. I think this might have been him because a couple of years prior I had paid to see a medium, and she told me that my husband said he would always be with me when I went on any adventures, and this trip was definitely an adventure since I've never been to Sweden before. Other than that, I have no idea who or what it could have been. Late shift, nurses share their spooky encounters. 1. Don't let them take me. The best I have heard is from a nurse who said that one night she was floated to Oncology at the hospital she used to work at. She was given a patient who was passing away and had been unconscious for several days. At one point during the night, the nurse went into the room, and the patient was at the top of the bed and looked at her and said, "Don't let them take me." The nurse was freaked out and asked her who was going to take her, and she said that black thing up there and pointed up in the air. This patient died within minutes. 2. The black shape standing over the bed. One night I was caring for a dying male patient. He was scared, and I spent quite some time with him, trying to calm and reassure him. Eventually he calmed, and I left the bedside and went over to the nurse's station, which was about 15 feet away. As I sat down, I glanced over at him, and there was a black shape standing over the bed, looking down at the patient. I was terrified and am sure it was something evil. 3. The escapee. I used to work in a state institution for developmentally disabled. We were temporarily relocated to another building for remodeling of our building. Anyways, I was working one night, second shift. We had a locked pica unit. I saw one of the residents walking down the hall. Very distinct gait and very distinct yellow t-shirt with a happy face on it. I went into the ward to let staff know that they had an escapee. This was a serious situation because this particular resident, Larry, would ingest absolutely anything, from clothing to pens to belts to, a bird's head, literally anything. He was also very reluctant to go back to his home ward, hence why I didn't bring him back myself. He needed 2 escorts. When we got back into the hall, less than 15 seconds later, Larry was gone. We searched the entire building. Outside, downstairs, all wards, he was nowhere to be found. This whole search lasted less than 10 minutes because I had all extra staff looking for him. I was just about to call the house supervisor to let her know that we lost someone when out from the bathroom walks Larry with one of the staff. He had been getting his bath in the bathroom for the last 30 minutes or so. Kind of freaky. I absolutely, without a doubt, saw Larry in the hallway. I never would have short-staffed the wards like I did if I hadn't seen him. Like I said, very distinctive gait, look, clothing. I took a lot of razzing that night. They all thought that I was crazy. Anyways, come to find out the next day, after the story goes around that I am crazy, ha ha, giggle giggle, funny, Larry had an identical twin brother who died in that building 10 years previously. 4. Nurse Betty. I was working in the NICU when we were threatened by a tornado. Some nurses got pulled to go to a sister hospital in town to assist in the disaster plan. When all was over, one of the nurses returned with this story. She was assisting the nurses in giving some meds before pulling all into the hallways. Every PT she went to said they already had their meds from that nice nurse in the white uniform and hat. She realized after she left that it's been a while since a nurse has worn a hat. That story revealed the urban legend of Nurse Betty. The story goes she had an affair with a married MD, became pregnant, then agreed to allow him to perform an abortion on her on the second floor or room. She died, and he went to jail. She never left the hospital and was seen frequently. The local newspaper would do an article of her every year around Halloween on her sightings. The hospital has since been replaced with college dorms. I wonder if any students have seen her? 5. He jumped out the window. I heard a story once about a 5th floor neuro unit. The storyteller told it to me in the first person. The nurse was at the desk, and a guy in white nursing garb came through the double doors, walked into an empty room, and didn't come back out. The nurse thought it was weird, so he went into the room, and it was empty. He went to the double doors and opened them, and there were 2 resp techs talking at the entrance who swore they'd been there talking the whole time and that nobody came through the doors. When one of his coworkers returned from lunch and he explained what happened, she was like, "Oh, that's just Bob, actually I don't remember the name," so the name was changed to protect my ignorance. He worked here as an LVN years ago and was accused of molesting. He was sure he was about to be arrested, so he jumped out the window in that room and ended himself. We see him all the time. 6. Calling from the grave. We had a patient, a chronic fair, always on the call button, who hated being on fluid restrictions. You know the type, the nurses have to take turns during the shift answering the call button so the primary can actually do other work. And this was a frequent flyer because he was very chronic, very borderline, and the hospital was the only place he wouldn't fluid overload. I worked 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. He died about 8 p.m. Oh, the look on his face, like, how could you let me die, like it was our fault. Anyway, family came and went by 9 p.m., and the funeral home was gone at 9:30 p.m. About 10 p.m., the call button starts going off. I was there, call button going off every 5 minutes. One of the nurses was a very spiritual girl. At about 2 a.m., after like 4 hours of this, Nurse Mary snaps, "Enough." She walks down to the room and, practically screaming into the empty room, "Mr. X, you have died. You can't be in here bothering us anymore. Move along. In the name of Jesus, I'm exorcising you from this plane of existence. Go to the light and be happy." And I kid you not, the call button stopped going off then and there. About 5 years ago, I encountered a 7-foot entity, but that's not even the creepy part. Hey everyone. This is my first time sharing here, so if this is not appropriate here, please let me know. I've told this story in a different group about supernatural beings in Alaska, and I was mostly laughed at / criticized, so if you're one of those types of people, please kindly just scroll past. Or I don't know. Tia. So based on the stories I've seen here, you guys should be familiar with little people, right? I live in Alaska, so we have both little people and big people. We have our own native words for both of them, and there are countless stories about encounters with them. Big people are basically the same as small, but just taller. A long time ago, before photos were relevant in Alaska, my ancestors lived in harmony with the little people. Yes, they're next door neighbors and shit. They lived like that for a while until one day, one of the dogs of the native people ate one of the little people's babies. As it had stumbled too close to the dog, food was scarce to try and keep every single dog pack well fed. The little people leader met with the native leader and suggested that they put down the dog and all would be forgiven. Mind you, this was the native's finest dog and was the leader for many years, and he decided against it. Yes, I know it's kind of petty, and I will never understand why he couldn't sacrifice one dog, as great as he was, and try and craft another leader to keep peace between the peoples. As you'd imagine, both sides split up, and it's been that way ever since. It does fascinate me how life would be so much different if the native leader complied with the deal. I do wonder how it would be to live with them from time to time. Anyway, one winter night in cold-ass Alaska at around 5 a.m., I went outside to smoke a cigarette. It was unnervingly quiet and dark, as it usually is at that time of night. I live in a really small town that barely stretches across a mile long. Outside of my house, there is one LED light connected to an electric pole that's about a block or two away. There's never anyone out riding their machines or four-wheelers at that time of night, and rarely is someone walking around, let alone running. I'm smoking my cigarette, and about halfway through, I saw it, at the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was someone taking a jog, but who would be jogging at 5 a.m. on a cold winter night? Not insulting my town, but no one duck and runs here, lol, not outside at least. There are some white teachers who do run, but all the teachers were out of town, back with their families in their home states, as it was the Christmas season. It was also snowing lightly. I turned to look, and oh duck. This 7-foot MF was just blasting down the street. I'm talking Usain Bolt shit going for that gold. I'm not really great at height perception, but I know he was at minimum 6 feet 8 inches -7. But here's where it gets creepy. When you run, you move your arms, right? It's just instinct, and I believe it does help you go faster with the right form. When I saw it, both arms were tucked on the side of his hips. No arms moving, but those legs were going at least 20 to 25 miles per hour. I was surprised at this point, but then I noticed something else it was doing. It watched me as it ran by. I could see the parka rough outlines at the top of its body, facing toward me the whole time it was in sight. No arms moving, only legs, looking at me as it burned through the road. Now I did say there was a bright LED light a couple blocks away from my house, and it faces towards my place, but that didn't do any help in trying to scope out its facial features, especially since the light was on the side as it was running and completely on the other side of its face as it was looking towards me. I watched it go by as it just watched me also. It felt like an eternity, but really it was only about a 10 to 15 seconds encounter. Right behind it, a fox was chasing after it. It appeared as though the fox had adopted it as a pet. Although it's widely known in the state that big and little people have supernatural powers, one of which is being able to transform into an animal it chooses. So I really don't know if that was its buddy or its pet, I'll never know. As soon as both of them were out of my sight, I went further onto the porch to see where they went. My friend, when I told him about that part, said, what if it just turned around and ran towards you when you did that? That made me realize how dumb I actually was trying to observe its whereabouts and that I never in a million years would go further onto the porch just to see it again. After I saw it had gone, I couldn't fathom what I just saw until later, but I noped TF back inside. Even my cigarette was unfinished. I didn't even put it in the cigarette container, I just threw it across the yard lamau. I went inside, continuing on like it never even happened. Went asleep, and I wouldn't talk about it for another year or so. I have no idea why. But when I did finally tell my said friend mentioned above, he immediately said the native word we have for tall people. A lot of my people choose to doubt me whenever I tell them about it, and it infuriates me because our culture has been involved with these kinds of beings for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. We have a lot of folklore stories, but we also have a bunch of accounts based on true encounters. If you read up on supernatural beings in native Alaska, there are some horrific ones that will straight up scare the shit out of you. It feels like this happened a long time ago, and I do think of it time and time again. Like, why? Why did it do that to me, of all people? I always heard stories of my friends running into little people, and I never did see them before. I would just be like, man, I wish I could run into a little person or something like that. I recall saying that a bunch of times. It's possible that one of their supernatural powers could sense this? Like almost mocking me, this is what you wanted to see, huh? I wouldn't go out to places at night unless I had a ride because who knows what it would do if I saw it again. This went on for about a year, then I kind of just forgot about it, I guess. Nowadays I can walk alone at night and be much less worrisome. I've done it countless times since then, and if it wanted to do something to me, it damn sure would have by now. People tell me that they choose who can see them and who can't. Their stealth is unmatched, and only a select few can see the big and little people. That's why I wonder, why me? Why did it choose to do that to me? Was it just to quench my thirst for the supernatural, telling me this shit is real? I'll never know, I'm certainly not going to ask it. Childhood encounter with a rabbit entity. I wanted to share this extended experience I had as a kid, mostly because it's the only experience of high strangeness that I've had that doesn't seem to match any of the anecdotal stories I've come across on the internet. When I was 5 years old, my family moved into a 100-year-old Victorian house that was known to the other people on the street as the haunted house. This was for good reason, and several things occurred in the house that fit the classic model of a haunting: disembodied voices, figures, objects falling, etc. But I'll leave those aside for now. Sometime in the first few months, I started having vivid nightmares of something I can only describe as an anthropomorphic rabbit being. It was male, white, stood upright on 2 legs, and was hyper-realistic. If my recollection is accurate, there was a time when it appeared in my dreams nearly every night. It wasn't explicitly evil, but as a small child who just moved into a very spooky old house, I was completely terrified. I became convinced that the rabbit lived in the walls, which functioned as a portal that he would use to move back and forth between the house and his dimension. I had a strong sense that he wanted to take me into his world and refused to sleep alone in my room for a long period of time, convinced that my mom's presence would prevent him from taking me. Of course, it's not unusual for small kids to have imaginary friends or monsters, and memory is a tricky thing, but something about the specificity of this experience has always stuck out to me. The entity had a very particular visual and emotional aesthetic, which in retrospect fits very closely to the trickster archetype. Fiction and folklore frequently feature anthropomorphic trickster rabbits, such as Bugs Bunny, Trix Rabbit, Brer Rabbit, and others. There are stories in at least Native American, Irish, and African folklore of humanoid bunny creatures who visit children. Not to mention Donnie Darko, which came out a few years after these experiences and hit a bit too close to home. The previews scared the ever-loving shit out of me. This isn't something that I've shared with very many people, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'd especially like to hear if anyone has ever had or heard of someone having an experience of a rabbit entity like this. Thanks for listening to IT, if you made it this far. There is an entity with me. I shared one of my childhood experiences and really felt comfortable sharing it with the community, knowing that it was actually a real thing. I always thought people would laugh at it. I feel comfortable sharing something that is a bit more close to me. Incident 1. At the age of 10-11, the story starts when I was 10-11. I loved cars and had a lot of toy cars. I was playing in my room, and Mum opened the door, calling my name, saying, "Dinner is ready." I said, "A few more minutes, Mum," without looking up. I heard nothing back, as usually she would say, "No, dinner first," or something, so I looked up in a few seconds, wondering why she was not saying anything. Mum was still standing at the door, and her face was blue. She was kind of freaked out at something behind me. I looked back, and there was nothing there, but I ran towards the door. I don't really remember why and what I thought at that point. She quickly smiled and told me to let us go. That was it. I didn't think of it much more as such. I was just a kid. When I became an adult, I didn't know what we were talking about when she said I didn't need to worry about anything and she felt that I would be looked after. I questioned why. She told me someone in dark clothes was standing behind me and looking down at me really close to my head. The first time she saw that, she freaked out, that time when I was playing with the toys. Because they were bending over, she could not see the clear face, and she mentioned that she saw it 4 more times on different occasions while I was asleep. I still don't understand. For some reason, she was smiling and said angels are looking after me. She did not feel fear for me. I felt kind of special. Smile. Incident 2. 8 years ago, out of the blue, my ex one morning said, "I'm going to tell you something, but don't freak out." I said nothing freaks me out. She said, "You are very well looked after." I thought in my head, oh no. I asked, "Why would you say that?" And she said she had seen someone standing next to my bedside, bending over so close to my face when I was sleeping, and she woke up to get some water. She never met my mom at that point, so there was no way she ever knew about my childhood incident. I never shared. She said they disappeared right away, and it was dark in the room, small night light, so she could not see the face clearly, but they did not feel any way threatening. It felt like they were looking after you. Honestly, At that point I freaked out pretty badly. I was far from my childhood home and never thought the entity would follow me. I actually forgot about it. I said, "Hey, you should not have told me this." She said she would not have if she felt it was something bad. I am not sure why she felt that. She never believed in spiritual beings or anything like that. There were a few uncomfortable and sleepless nights, but I managed to overcome them. Incident 3 years ago, while I was asleep, my ex, a different one, literally jumped on the bed, grabbed my arm firmly, and began crying. I woke up with pain in my arms. She literally stabbed her nails in my arm. Smile, I thought maybe there was a spider or something, I asked, and she said there was someone standing next to my bedside, leaning over and staring at me. I knew exactly what she meant, but I dismissed it, saying, "No, you were exhausted and dreaming," because she was freaking out crazy. We never discussed that ever again because she was very different from my previous ex. She was legitimately freaking out. Incident 4, 2 years ago, suddenly, I woke up from a deep slumber. 0% awake and literally saw a tall person standing and leaning their face right next to mine. My heart almost stopped, honestly. It was there for a good 5 seconds, and I was in so much shock that I literally did not know what to do. I couldn't determine if it was a dream, yet it profoundly awakened me. I reached my hands to push them away from me as self-defense, but they disappeared like dust and stars in a medium-lit room. It was all air and dust slowly falling off the floor. I was alone at that time. My heart was out of control, literally, it was pumping out of my chest. I had to leave the room, no physical dust on the floor at all. I just kept thinking someone was behind me and kept turning back. For 2 weeks I booked a hotel as I could not go back home and made sure someone was with me when I slept. Then I convinced myself that maybe my mom and ex are right, possibly something is there, but it's not bad. I started convincing myself so I could sleep. I still, to this day, when I wake up at night, look around the room and honestly expect someone to be standing there, but I never saw it again, so far. Every night when I even slightly wake up from sleep, I look around. Always expecting someone will be there. It is such a bad habit now and happens even when I switch sides. Most of the time I cover my face in a blanket because I know they come close to my face and stare, so I try my best to cover my face at least when falling asleep. Sometimes that freaks me out too, knowing behind that blanket they might still be there. I take the cover off, and no one is there. But I don't know how to describe it. I am so scared, but I am not afraid. It is very strange. I know seeing someone like that again will freak me out, so I am scared of it and the shock, and I could have a heart attack, but I don't have fear or fear of life, if that makes sense. So I am not panicking or anything. It is just that scary feeling of seeing someone suddenly. I was wondering if anyone else has this or knows what it could be. I honestly do not want to see it again regardless. I do feel like I might have a heart attack next time because I honestly can't tell you how my heart was pumping when I had this encounter. I am happy if something is looking after me, but why and how? Staring at me in the night, goosebumps, is very scary. It can also frighten others, as it's not exclusive to my vision. 3 other individuals have also witnessed it. I was about 12 at the time. Every year my parents and I would drive from Montreal to Nova Scotia to visit family. Having always gone the Trans-Canada route, we decided to go through the states for a change, so we ended up going SE through Maine and eventually on to NB then NS. I remember we were in a very, very remote area, like we hadn't seen a house for a long time. This was before GPS and Google Maps, so there was a growing concern in the vehicle that we might run out of gas. I don't remember the name of the road, but it was a country road that had a mountain on the right side and went straight up through dense bush. On the left it was dense bush and a steep downhill where I could make out a river at the bottom of the cliff, about 75 to 100 down the hill. Trees hung over the road, so despite it being a sunny day, the road was shady, with the exception of places where the sun would break through. I heard my dad up front ask Mom, "What the duck is that up ahead?" As I leaned over to look up and down the road, we could all see what looked like a man off in the distance on the side of the road. Too far to see color or anything, just a big dark shape standing there. As we rolled on down the road, this dude, or whatever it was, crossed the road, both lanes, and I shot you not, 3 to 4 steps, once on the other side of the road, just vanished into the woods. As we got to the spot where he had crossed, Dad slowed right down to look around. Nothing, not a sight of anyone, no trail, nothing. No one knows what they saw, but 30 years later it gets brought up every couple of years, and the feelings are mutual. Ducking weird and creepy. It was everywhere. This occurred in 2015, when I was working as a ranch hand. The ranch I worked for had a couple hundred head of cattle on another place that wasn't part of their home ranch, and it was about 10 miles from the area I would usually be working around. It was about 6 in the afternoon when I got contacted on the ranch radio. Yes, we still use those out here just in case the cell phone service starts ghosting us, telling me that no one had been up to check the cattle for the day and to please go do that. I hopped into my 4x4 Ford Ranger and headed out to check the herd. It took me a while to get there, as the last 4 miles of road was really more of a doubled-up cow trail. Now, it was September at this point, and the sun would go down around 7:30, and it was getting close to 6:30 by the time I made it to the herd. I found hers all rather close together, like they had been gathered up. Most of the time cattle do stay in groups, with a few separating themselves here and there, but never bunched up in a tight group unless something was hurting them, and usually if they were being attacked, they still wouldn't be bunched up like that. I decided to park my truck for a moment, and reaching behind the passenger seat, I grabbed my mag light and my .357 revolver, quickly throwing the shoulder holster I carried it in on. I grabbed the smaller headlamp I had in the glove box and placed it in the passenger seat as well. Then I continued driving for a bit towards a stand of brush and trees that the herd seemed to be the most interested in watching. I shut my truck down, putting the keys in the ashtray and grabbing the headlamp and my jacket. Turning on my mag light, I walked over to the stand of trees. I suddenly got that loving feeling of being where I shouldn't be and of being watched. Still, I knew I needed to figure out what was out here. I drew my pistol from its holster and brought back the hammer so I was ready if an upset bear came charging out of the woods at me. Still moving my light over the expanse of dimly lit forest before me, looking at the ground with my headlamp for any signs of disturbance or footprints. Then, I berated myself. I was walking into a horror movie setting, just like the idiots you always like screaming at. I mumbled a few self-deprecating words to myself, the last sentence being, "I'm such a superstitious dumbass." Then, I heard the exact same words repeat. For a split second, it didn't register that it had been echoed, but then, well, I froze. I didn't even finish the step I was in the middle of. I didn't move, or rather couldn't move. I fought with my body and mind, telling myself internally that it wasn't time to be a ducking iceberg and to move, but my body wouldn't cooperate.
It really did seem like forever came and went before finally, in a split second, I spun, maglight in one hand, headlamp illuminating where I thought the reply had come from, and I pointed my gun.
Click went the hammer. I almost stroked out and had a heart attack all at once when I heard the click but not the firing of a bullet. Then, in the same moment, I saw something. I say something, because as soon as my eyes registered that something was there, it was gone. My hearing told me more. It ran through the bushes off to my left, and just as soon as the cracking of twigs and rocks underfoot started, they stopped. I snapped back to myself again, quickly pressing the release on the pistol's cylinder release, and inspected the rounds. One of them had a dent in the primer, but it hadn't fired. I pushed the round from the cylinder, and without realizing it, I dropped my maglight to grab one of the 12 bullets in the outside loops of my shoulder holster. Replacing the bullet and slapping the revolver cylinder back into place, I looked up, cocking back the hammer once more. I looked all around me, slowly, bending down to pick up my maglight after realizing I had dropped it. I didn't know what to do. Would running provoke it to chase? Had it killed any cattle? Did it really repeat my words and mimic me perfectly, or was that in my head? Questions clouded my mind and muddled together with the ever louder beat of my heart and the white noise that comes with adrenaline rushing through your body. I stood there, looking around in a circle for probably 5 minutes. Finally a thought broke through the rest, and the flight side of the fight or flight took over, and even in my cowboy boots, which I must stress are in no way good for running, I ran from that forest, and my hearing had cleared, allowing me to hear that something else was running through the brush behind me. I blindly fired a round back in that direction. I never got any indication that whatever it was had slowed down, but it did let out what I can only describe as a supernatural version of a snarled oof, like a beast getting hit in the chest and having some air knocked out of it. I finally could see my truck, and I still could hear whatever it was behind me. Then, something made me duck and roll. As I did, I felt air being swung through as I lunged to the side, and when I came back up, the furry mass was before me, and I quickly shot, not aiming for anything in particular, but hitting it. This time I hear a twisted snarl, along with a painful yelp and growl of a hurt dog all mixed together, and then I realize I am at my truck. I fling open the door, throwing myself in and grabbing the keys from the ashtray, starting it and hitting the gas, which of course makes it spin out for a moment. Then something hits my truck, jolting it out of its tire spin and getting me moving, pointing in the wrong direction. I began to turn around as fast as I could, gas all the way to the floor, and I finally hit some rocky ground, and the tires took full grip. I got up to about 20 miles per hour, which, if you have ever tried traveling down a glorified cow trail, is way too fast. Anyone who had the luxury of being sane would have never gone faster than 5 or 10 down that trail, but I didn't have that. I was almost to where the trail turned into more of a road when that beast jumped out in front of my truck, and then before I hit it, it leapt up and came down behind me. I sped back to the homestead faster than I ever had, and by that time I realized I could have called for help on the radio. I told the rancher that it was a massive wolf of some kind, and he said he would contact a federal Forest Service ranger that was a friend of his and ask him to investigate, since it was on Forest Service land and we technically couldn't hunt the beast down. I kept telling myself the rest of the night that it was really just a massive wolf, but I knew better. The next day, that Forest Service ranger stopped by and came to talk to me. He asked me the usual questions about the color, relative size, and those sorts of things. Then he asked me something I found to confirm my belief that it wasn't just a wolf. He suddenly looked at me and asked, "Are you sure it was a wolf?" He asked. Yes, I held it in my story. He thought for a moment and then pulled out his phone. "Here, look at these pictures. I found this kill site this morning while I was out there looking around those woods. I am not sure what to make of it, and I have seen some bad kills. I've never seen anything so bloody." He finished. I took a look. The only way I can describe what I saw, in a reference that most people can probably understand, is the signs that the White Walkers from Game of Thrones make when they make their mark, only turning the blood and gore up to 10. The ranger had taken a short panorama of the site to file with the investigation, and there was blood and guts everywhere. He said it had been a cow, based on what was left. I soon moved on to more safe employment at a retail store. Of course, being the magnet of all creepy and horrifying things I am, I bet you can guess just how long it took for me to endure yet another set of events that just continue to reaffirm my belief that some things are more than what the rest of the world assumes or wants to believe. I worked at or lived near a summer camp in the northeastern United States that runs from late June to early August every summer. The main attraction of the camp is that it is an overnight camp. Staff and campers arrive on Sunday afternoon and leave Friday evening each week during the camp season while living isolated in the camp during the week. The camp has many cabins used for sleeping, a huge mess hall for meals, and about 10 other buildings ranging from quite large, single-story centers to small supply sheds. The entire camp property stretches for acres and acres and is incredibly beautiful in that lush, cool, forest green way that the Northeast has in the summer. There's everything from big, open fields and forests to a large pond full of fish and a long stretch of beautiful ravine with lots of exposed shale and wildlife. It is set a good distance off any main roads, and you have to travel up a long driveway to get into the camp. The entire property feels like its own, isolated universe. Campers are not allowed to have electronics, staff can in the evenings and on break. No computers, no cars, and little communication with the outside world apart from what is required from the camp directors. When needed, staff carry walkie-talkies to keep in touch across the expanse of the camp. I went there as a child for 10 years and worked there for 4 years, and it's safe to say I have a whole lot of love for that place. But for anyone who has worked there, you would know that the place has a long and very complex history with the paranormal. I could write a full-length book with all the stories I have heard and have personally experienced there over many summers. I'd like to give a good overview of what the place is like as a staff member and share a couple of the more chilling encounters I've had. Many still give me shivers to this day, even though I have been somewhat desensitized to them for a while now. Most of these encounters I'm going to share with you happened between 2014 and 2018, while I was training and working as a counselor. I was between 16 and 20 at the time. Most of the activity would happen at night, during the training week, and just generally around the staff of the camp. Rarely did the campers ever come in contact with the entities that lurk within the woods there. Why that is, I honestly couldn't tell you. My memories there as a young girl contain not even a trace of fright or things I couldn't explain. In contrast to that, the experiences I had there as a young adult had me nearly in tears. Consistently, there were things that would happen each year without fail. To start, during the training week or after the kids had gone to bed, many of us counselors would lay out under the stars outside the mess hall to unwind from the day. It had a beautiful, clear view of the constellations out over the rec field and onto the hills beyond. Many nights, we would see quick, blinking lights moving in erratic patterns, odd meteor showers when there was none predicted in the area, and often see strange red flickering objects deep out in the night sky, and no, these were not planets, as they would often be in the wrong place in the sky and only stick around one evening out of the week. I had a few friends there who had a good understanding of our solar system. I spent many nights looking at their utterly baffled faces as they looked up at some oddity that had appeared, exclaiming that what we were seeing was just simply impossible, despite 10+ witnesses to it happening. Counselors often cannot go an entire summer without experiencing nightmares, many of which include figures standing in the corners of their cabins or at the foot of their bunks. I had these nightmares every year except my first year working there. I would wake in a cold sweat to a quiet cabin and the kids resting peacefully nearby. Screams and voices in the night, carried into camp off the wind from the pond, footsteps pacing around buildings only for there to be no one out of bed, and items disappearing and reappearing in illogical places were all incredibly common. Doors with heavy padlocks would be found open with no one to blame. Occasionally, a counselor would get locked into a building they were working in, despite no one being around to lock the door. People would walk into this job being complete skeptics and leave believers. Returning staff had to make peace with the things within the camp and just deal with it and give fair warning to newcomers about the mysteries that seemed to live in the very floorboards of that camp. My first memory of there being anything paranormal within the camp was in 2014, while I was training for my first year as a camp counselor. I remember that all throughout my childhood, there had been a singular, flat tombstone that lay on the hill leading down to the camp's pool. It sat right outside the girls' village, the term used for all the cabins where the female campers and counselors slept. It was incredibly old, so old that the name and dates were unreadable, but the way that the text was formatted made it obvious it was someone's grave. No one could really give a good explanation as to why it was there. Everyone I asked about it simply told me it had been there long before them. My first year there, I remember there being lots of drama concerning the paranormal, but I was too young and not close enough with the older counselors for any of them to share what was going on. But by the end of the year, the tombstone had been removed, and no one was allowed to talk about it or mention it if any of the campers asked. I remember thinking to myself that even though the tombstone was gone, someone still lay buried on that hill, no matter how long ago they had been laid to rest. Maybe the camp directors thought that by getting rid of it, they would bring an end to the paranormal activity. Unfortunately, they were wrong. Alongside the mysterious tombstone, many stories rotated through my co-counselor friends and me as the newest staff members. The first stories I was ever told about camp happened during a training weekend in June of 2014. My friends and I had gotten on the topic of scary stories, and the older counselors jumped in to have a little fun with us. Side note, counselors at this camp were all given counselor names in our first year, and we strictly used those names during the summer to add a little extra fun for the campers. For the story's purpose, I'll refer to all the people in these stories by their camp names. An older counselor named Gadget was the first to pipe up, telling us about the two famous ghosts of the camp. He told us about the ghost of a boy who could be seen running through the rec field and the streetlights from the dead-end road that ran along the edge of the camp. Gadget told us he had been hit by a car after running after a ball and now spent his afterlife running as a shadow through the camp, scaring anyone awake to see him. The second story was that of the woman in white. Under the same streetlights that lit the dead-end road that bordered the camp, a few small houses sat. On some nights, a woman wearing a long, flowing white dress could be seen standing on one of the deck porches. She would spend the night standing and staring up at the camp and be gone by sunrise. My fellow first-year counselors and I were, of course, quite scared by this point. It was far past midnight, and we were gathered under the floodlights of a brightly lit pavilion near the rec field and dead-end road. They had us scared by the end of the storytelling. Luckily, another one of the older counselors, someone who would come to be one of my dearest friends during my time there, called Slag, simply shook his head and furrowed his eyebrows as he watched the older counselors spook us. Later that evening, Slag took me up to the top of the hill that overlooked the rec field and the dead-end road. He could tell how scared I was of the rumors, but from our vantage point, he explained and showed me what Gadget and his friends had been talking about. Down on the rec field, the streetlights caused long, slanting shadows to fall in a sickly yellow onto the grass. On one of the light poles, there was an electrical box, and the way the shadow fell onto the grass made the perfect shape of a small child, caught mid-step. When I saw it, it made me jump at how realistic it looked. It was no wonder it became popular, as it truly could be mistaken for an actual apparition. Slag also pointed out to me the woman in white. Again, I didn't see her at first, but Slag's description helped. The woman in white was simply an oversized American flag that hung on one of the house's porches. That evening was clear and breezy. The moonlight caused the flag to look milky white, and the wind made it dance slowly around the flagpole just as the dress of an actual woman would float in the breeze. I started to laugh in relief, but Slag's face stayed serious. He went on to explain to me that even though these were merely scary coincidences, we were not alone here. He explained to me some of what I have shared with you, and it made me turn serious as well. That night, my friend and I huddled into the same small bunk out of this newborn fear. We didn't realize it was the beginning of a long road of stories of our own. One of the places in camp that granted me the most unnerving experiences was a building we referred to as day camp. We had a program where we would bus in the youngest age group of campers, and they would have their own day of camp activities before returning home around 4 p.m. The building was the only two-story building on the property and used to be a house before the camp was built in 1925. The main space had big, beautiful windows that let in the sunset. The kitchen worked but was a little run down. The upstairs was a large, attic-like room that served as a space to use for activities on the days it rained. Day camp was easily the farthest building from all others. You had to walk through a stretch of woods on small, rocky trails to get there, and oftentimes, you couldn't even hear the sounds of other people from the building, and that's saying a lot, as there are easily 300 loud, hyper kids and preteens there each week. Day camp never felt right to me. The feel of the building gave me the Blair Witch Project vibes, something I didn't feel in many other places in the camp. I tried to never go there alone, though I did need to close the building by myself occasionally. My body would tense up, and I felt as if something physically pressed down on my skin any time I would walk through there. Every time I turned my back to an empty room, I felt as if an entire crowd of silent, watchful people stared through me. The boys' village was the nearest cluster of buildings to day camp. Unless day camp was being used in the evening by someone and the lights were on, it was nearly impossible to see the building with a blind eye. The dark brown would blend it into the expanse of woods that hid it from the rest of the camp. Day camp always got closed down around 4 p.m., after the day campers returned home. All the rooms were checked, lights turned off, and the padlock was back in place and locked until the next morning. My male counselor friends shared with me that every summer, once or twice a week, once the kids had gone to bed and the boys sat outside talking, someone would notice a light on in day camp. And this wasn't simply someone leaving the light on from the day. Sometimes, the same counselor who had closed day camp earlier that day would see the lights on in the downstairs, glowing in solidarity through the dark woods. On these nights, the boys would take turns walking down the dark path there and back to get the light, returning shivering and swearing they will never do that again. My personal experience with day camp came during the summer of 2016. Every summer, the camp performs something called a missing camper drill. This simply prepares counselors for the event that a scared child would run away, allowing staff to react quickly and locate and calm them. The drill on a good day is already something that is taken incredibly seriously by all of the staff. The missing camper is a randomly chosen counselor each training week, and all of the other counselors have to go through the procedure of tracking the child down. To do this, camp is split into sections, and the eldest staff take walkie-talkies, divide up the areas, and sprint around camp looking for the missing camper, shouting their name, looking under and around structures in camp, and checking any locked buildings. The camp director will go around before the drill and do things to throw off the searching counselors, too. They'll unlock doors, lock others, and move things around just to get everyone in the mindset of an actual drill. Of course, the area I was given to search, alone, may I add, was day camp. As I ran through the woods and towards the looming house, I felt a huge sense of dread fall over me, and I seriously considered not searching it at all and just telling the other staff that I did. With shaking hands, I unlocked the day camp door and walked around inside, calling the name of the girl who was acting as the missing child. The floorboards creaked, and I remember how incredibly silent the whole house felt, apart from my movements. The sun was setting at the time, and creamy orange light fell through the length of the building from the windows. It was so unnatural compared to the busier parts of the camp. I couldn't hear the other counselors searching, not even when I strained my ears. Every room and corner I checked, I braced myself to come face to face with the spirits I saw in the nightmares, the ones I'd heard crunching over gravel in the middle of the night, the ones who spoke softly in the dark and made even grown men run back into their bunks, unnerved. The building was clear. I sighed in relief as I locked the door firmly behind me and headed back outside. The air had begun to get chilly, and I hoped the drill would be over soon. Searching in the dark would be near impossible, and I knew that Swift, my friend acting as the missing kid, had no desire to creep around camp in the dark, either. As I walked past the external cellar doors that led under day camp, I gave them a good shake to check the padlock on them. Locked. This was a location I was previously told I did not need to open or check for this drill, anyways. I went on and searched the woods surrounding the building, found nothing, and reported it on my walkie. I was told to keep double-checking the area until Swift was found and the drill ended. I started walking back, slower this time, as I was fairly positive Swift was over half a mile away on the other side of camp. As day camp came back into sight through the trees, I froze in confusion and fear. The cellar doors of the day camp cellar were both flung open, and a yellowish light shone from inside. It was just becoming dark enough that the light spilled out and illuminated the space around it, while the shadows of its surroundings only pushed in darker. Never in my previous 3 years working at that camp did I even know those doors even opened. Never did I know that there was even a key for that padlock, nor did I know there was a working light down there. I was completely stunned. Shivers ran through me, certainly not from the evening chill. "Swift?" I called. Not in the way I would call to a camper, but as I would call her normally. Nothing moved, and nothing made a noise. The fear felt cold and numbing in my veins. I crept to the top of the cellar stairs and peered down. The space was lit by a single exposed light bulb, showing me 6 or 7 rotting wooden steps and cold-looking stone walls, all broken with age. The floor was dirt, and there were no objects inside the cellar. The sound of my radio going off that Swift had been found nearly made me jump out of my skin. I fell backwards onto my butt in the grass and spent another second staring at the bizarre scene in front of me. I scrambled up and back towards the rest of camp as quickly as possible. To my surprise, as I arrived back, my friend Amino also appeared visibly shaken and was talking quickly. She was telling us that during the drill, she was walking by one of the maintenance sheds on camp, another location with a padlocked door that we weren't including in the drill. To her surprise, the door started shaking violently against its padlock, much more than any wind or draft could do. Amino, fully believing that Swift was trapped in there as part of the scenario, quickly found my other friend Handles and got the key to open the shed. As they swung it open, they found no one. In fact, the maintenance man, Sparrow, hadn't even been to camp that day, so there was no way anything or anyone could have gotten trapped back there. She was so shaken up, she could barely get her story out. I also told everyone there what I encountered. Everyone looked at us, jarred by our stories, but none were that surprised. Did anyone open the doors to the day camp cellar as part of the drill? I asked some of the senior staff members. They shook their heads. Swift wasn't located near either of those spots, anyways. She was hiding up past the pond, Wonder, our program director, said. Swift's hiding spot was nearly as far away as day camp was from the rest of camp, but on the complete opposite side of the property. Everyone was shocked, but there was nothing to be done. The camp directors and senior staff could do little to comfort us, because they knew it too, we simply weren't alone. Later that night, my friend Tantor and I returned to day camp to close the cellar and put the padlock back in its place. It hasn't been open for any reason since then. Day camp continued to be my weakness as I went into my 4th year as a program specialist in 2017. That year, during one of the programs I ran, my group of campers chose day camp to be our meeting place. I was reluctant at first, but this time I had my friend Ouija with me as my co-counselor. He is someone who I would trust in the Paris catacombs if need ever arose. He was, and is, incredibly in tune with the paranormal world and is very knowledgeable on how to communicate with it properly, in a way that they listen. He explained to me that my hunches about day camp were true, but that there was most likely no place in camp that didn't attract spirits in some form or another. I made sure to always have him nearby inside day camp. By the end of the summer, I could almost relax in there. It was as if whatever dwelled there graciously took its eye off me and let me rest. I realize how long this collection of stories has gone on. In truth, this isn't even half of what I have seen or heard about from people I trust. But I'll leave it here for now. Fortunately for myself and anyone who worked at that camp, whatever spirits share that space do not seek to physically harm anyone. They like to be seen, talked about, and remembered through stories. They enjoy adding their own mystery to camp. I truly believe they only wish to remain a part of the camp's identity. It is a place with much history. My grandfather went to the same camp as a child himself, and so much energy inhabits that place, I think they cannot help but want to join in. The deep green woods, the aging structures, the ruins, and the secrets and stories that camp holds are their home, and anyone who treads there comes to learn and respect that. Even though I've made peace with my experiences at this camp, and I'm even applying to work there again this summer, I've always felt that camps like this one have their fair share of stories. If there's anyone around who has had something similar to them happen at a summer camp, I'd really love to hear about it.